So the vertex in astrology is referred to as your point of fate. But you may be wondering, what does a fated point actually mean? What does it look like? How do I spot these themes in my tangible, real life beyond just the theoretical definitions of the point that I read about online? Because it's easy to theorize what this point means. It's a lot harder to spot it in your real life, trust me. So in this video, I want to give a comprehensive breakdown of what exactly the vertex and the anti-vertex mean, what they could look like, and provide a guide on interpreting this in your birth chart by sign and by house. But before we go into your personal placements, which I do have timestamps for down in the description just because I'm a homie like that, let's give a mechanical breakdown of what this axis actually tells us. So the vertex and the anti-vertex outline the axis of fated encounters, timeline shifts, sudden course corrections, and the people who feel like destiny walking through the front door. If your ascendant and descendant represent your conscious self and the mirror you experience outside of yourself, then the vertex and anti-vertex tell a bit of a similar story, but primarily through the lens of your fate, your baseline environment, and the potential trajectory shifts. The vertex, as you know, it's not a planet. It doesn't generate its own light or energy. It's a mathematical tripwire. Astronomically, the vertex is the exact point in the Western Hemisphere where the prime vertical intersects the ecliptic. I won't go deep into that, just know that it is a calculated point essentially. And because it sits on the western side of your chart, usually somewhere between the 5th and 8th houses, although it can fall in the 4th or 9th house for some, it may function like an unpredictable descendant. You don't necessarily do the vertex. The vertex can often feel like it just happens to you, and it may act as the sudden destination, the timeline shift, or a fated drop. However, the shifts this placement can bring may seem minor at the time, or they could be visibly life-altering. And from my studies of this point, I think part of why people struggle to grasp the vertex is because of how heavily romanticized and dramatized, trust me, I have Leo placements, I know what drama looks like, these turning points are. And so in reality, a fated event could show up as a blip in the moment, something you don't even think twice about until you look back. But that momentary blip could completely change the road you walk on, or at the very least, the way you exist. Its exact opposite, which is the anti-vertex, sits in the east. And astrologers often call the anti-vertex an unconscious point, which makes it sound like a deeply repressed and psychological secret or just a passive room you're standing in. But in practice, your anti-vertex is your conscious and unconscious baseline related to your fated encounters. And so it could encompass your ingrained personal traits, your active deliberate pursuits, or the literal settings and environments you may naturally put yourself in or just be engaging with when that fated moment hits. It's kind of your default state in some way regarding fated events, and this energy could act as a blind spot, not because you're not actively doing it, but because you could be so immersed in this baseline energy that your conscious mind might not realize you are engaging with it. And you could actively, whether consciously or unconsciously, drive this anti-vertex environment until the pressure cooker reaches a critical threshold. And at any given moment, probably when you don't expect it, that opposite energy could respond by introducing a catalyst event that disrupts your trajectory. And that disruption can drop directly into your vertex energy, whether through a gentle nudge or a whiplash event. And while you cannot fully control your fate, you still play a role in the story of your life ultimately. And I like to describe the anti-vertex as the part of your destiny that feels like a comfort zone. And so when it gets activated, it still carries that fated weight, but in a deeply familiar way almost. And the vertex, on the other hand, is the eye-opening, paradigm-shifting jolt. And because this is an axis, it could also function as a continuous bidirectional integration loop. And so the vertex may bring a fated event to you, altering your life path, but once you arrive at that new destination, you may be able to use your active anti-vertex traits to ground it or navigate it and integrate it. Conversely, though, you can take the gift or the lesson or the realization of the vertex and bring it back to completely upgrade and revitalize your anti-vertex baseline. And this axis essentially lies dormant until it's triggered, and this can happen in a few main ways, primarily through transits or through synastry, and the way you experience it depends entirely on which end of the axis is hit, and you probably can't predict fully when this will happen, although maybe to a degree you can. First, hitting the anti-vertex when a potent transit such as a slow-moving outer planet or a major lunation like an eclipse hits your anti-vertex, or a person enters your life whose planets land there, even if no transits are involved at the time, it could illuminate your fated baseline. You could become consciously pulled into this anti-vertex energy, whether through the setting or the circumstance, or just by experiencing the themes of the sign and house in general, and it could feel like you are actually moving somewhere, accompanied by a feeling of deep familiarity. It is this illuminated focus on your baseline that could inherently create an opposition to your vertex. And that opposition could act as the mechanic that eventually brings the fated reroute, potentially encouraging you to step out of your routine and pushing you towards a new destination. Now let's talk about hitting the vertex directly. So when a transit or a synastry person hits your vertex directly, the fated destination could arrive completely unannounced. Although if it's a transit, it's kind of announced. You get what I'm saying here. So maybe a sudden event, an unexpected beginning, an abrupt ending, or a literal person embodying the exact energy kind of drops directly into your lap, and it's this exact energy that opens your eyes and shifts your way of moving or connecting to the world. And this catalyst usually arrives carrying the nature of the sign your vertex is in, while either arriving through or completely redirecting the house your vertex sits in. And this can instantly restructure your trajectory while you're just simply going about your routine, conscious anti-vertex actions. In astrology, one end of the scale will always impact and inform the other. That's just a fact of it. And so to show you exactly how literal and mechanical this axis can be, I want to share a story from my own chart about how my active baseline triggered a fated lifelong shift in my direction. And I'll give more examples like this when we get into all of the sign and house placements, just so you can visualize what I am explaining. And so when I was in the 4th grade, Pluto was transiting my vertex in late degree Sagittarius. And as we know, Pluto likes to shake things up. And if you do the math, you can figure out that my anti-vertex is in Gemini, in my case in the 11th house. Now the 11th house governs our connection to the larger web, the collective, friends, and our community. In my case, my classroom friends, but also my larger dreams and my goals are the relevant players. Also at the time, I had a literal physical blind spot. My eyesight was poor and I couldn't see the board in class. And so to survive this, I was consciously using my Gemini anti-vertex traits by racking my brain, gathering fragmented puzzle pieces, asking a million immediate questions to my teacher, and receiving help from my friends or my network just to get by. For some reason, though, I couldn't put together why I was struggling, but nonetheless, the unconscious and conscious Gemini energy was active and alive. And then the fated event arrived as a direct hit to my vertex in the form of a teacher who noticed my struggle. By the way, I was struggling with this for years. They didn't just tell me I needed glasses, although they did help me get glasses. They kind of stepped in as a fated Sagittarius visionary who completely understood that I needed guidance to help me expand my horizons and to learn better. They saw my potential when no other teacher had, and they coached me. They helped me catch up on subjects I had been struggling with for years, and in true Sagittarius fashion, made learning fun by illuminating the bigger picture and getting me, hyped up about it. And by helping me get glasses and by believing in me with a Sagittarian optimism, they fundamentally changed my trajectory in ways that inevitably led to the creation of this video. So through this teacher, I developed a massive fifth house sense of joy and genuine fun for learning and philosophy. I didn't like learning before then, and then that kind of became the thing that brought me joy. And that's kind of what officially turned learning into a hobby for me permanently. But true to the continuous feedback loop of the axis, the story didn't end there, because eventually I took that newfound fifth house Sagittarius joy and brought it right back to my 11th house Gemini baseline by deciding I wanted to teach and share that information with a massive network right here on YouTube one day. And I wanted to take information that others felt was fragmented and make it approachable while giving it meaning. I became so inspired by the power of a single teacher that I vowed to use that guidance to make a difference myself one day, connecting that joy to an 11th house dream of cleverly sharing information myself. And so I know that was a lot to cover. There's a lot of definitions, a lot of explanations, and you want to know what this can mean for you. You want to know, what to look out for, what to pay attention to, how to reflect back in your life to figure out how this placement has played out for you. And so I do have timestamps down in the description where I will cover the vertex and the anti-vertex just so you understand what it could mean for you. And so now let's get into it in 3, 2, 1, go. If you have an Aries vertex, then this section is for you. And so to properly interpret this placement, we must separate the house from the sign, because your house placement outlines the literal area of life that receives the change. But the sign of Aries explains the how. It's the energetic style and the traits of the fated encounter. And to get an even more specific hint about how this could happen, look at where Mars, which is the ruler of Aries, is placed in your natal chart. And so with an Aries vertex, the fated moments in your life could carry a trajectory of forward movement or instinct and action in some way. And the resulting encounter could introduce a scenario defined maybe by rapid execution or independence. And the results can be literal, like an event pushing you to take off on a solo sprint, but it can also be very energetic, shifting your trajectory to encourage independent decision making or action without a consensus in some way. But this fated energy does not happen in a vacuum. So to find the initial setting, we have to look directly across the chart to your Libra anti-vertex, because the anti-vertex represents your conscious and unconscious baseline. It encompasses your ingrained traits, your active pursuits, and the settings you may naturally put yourself in. And in terms of the vertex, it is the first domino that kind of falls. And so with a Libra anti-vertex, your baseline environment could be driven by your pursuit of balance, equilibrium, fairness, diplomacy, and understanding the world through the lens of an outside perspective. And you could actively use the world as one end of the scale and yourself at the other, often positioning yourself maybe as a mediator. And your repetitive participation in this highly deliberative, collaborative environment could act as a pressure cooker. And the environment may eventually respond by introducing a catalyst that disrupts this weighted trajectory. And the result of this timeline shift is an Aries outcome, which could demand maybe immediate solo action in some way. And so how to notice the trigger building is you could notice maybe a strong focus on maintaining a shared agreement or keeping the peace or analyzing the fairness or balance of a situation. And this could be accompanied by a realization that you are waiting for permission to move in some way. And the trigger event could arrive circumstantially right as your deliberation reaches a plateau, introducing a variable that calls for maybe a quick reaction in some way. And so if you're curious on what this looks like in practice, I will talk about a few examples. Maybe one example is that you could operate in an environment of intellectual debate. Maybe you actively weigh the pros and the cons of a partnership, just for example. And this conscious stalling could act as a catalyst, kind of introducing a high stakes variable. And so the result of this timeline shift could maybe force a pivot, maybe replacing deliberation or, your current state of the partnership with raw execution where you need to act entirely alone. It's like maybe you were relying on somebody too much and then something happens and then boom, all of a sudden you have to act on your own. And another example is maybe you could build a collaborative or balanced dynamic. Maybe you consciously smooth over conflicts, but then an abrupt event could occur, such as a collaborator dropping out, or maybe somebody, not like kicks you to the curb, but maybe they can't help you anymore. And the resulting trajectory could temporarily suspend your peace, kind of placing you in an environment that demands solo pioneering and fighting strictly for your own cause. But another example, less about, maybe relationships, is you could direct your focus towards maybe conceptualizing an idea or kind of mediating an idea, making it more balanced and better. And then a situation could arise that shatters the concept phase, and the result could shift your trajectory out of the conceptual balance and throw you directly into physical momentum, where you kind of have to, pursue what it is that you're trying to design on your own and very quickly and without, as much deliberation. And another example is maybe you could move entirely at the speed of consensus, ensuring everybody and everything around you is kind of on the same page and is at equilibrium. And then maybe a circumstantial event could dissolve the agreement. And maybe the result naturally places you kind of alone in some way, where the only path forward involves charging ahead on pure instinct instead of, waiting for your environment to do that for you. And then because this is an axis, the anti-vertex could also be how you react to the fated change. And so maybe once the environment shifts you into a fast-paced Aries kind of destination, you don't have to blindly destroy everything in your path. You don't have to let go of maybe a desire to balance out your, environment. You could consciously use your Libra diplomacy and fairness and balance to ensure your Aries momentum doesn't needlessly burn bridges or isn't too hasty. Or you could take the raw courage you found in the Aries vertex and then bring it back to upgrade maybe your Libra relationships or your Libra sense of balance or whatever it is that you pursue with Libra in your life, ensuring that what you build, your partnerships, your sense of balance are fueled by honesty and fueled by, movement rather than people pleasing or stagnation trying to balance the scales. And so when a transit hits the anti-vertex or a person enters your life whose planets land here, it illuminates your partnerships and your focus on fairness, either directly or indirectly. And this energy could feel highly familiar and comfortable for better or for worse. And it kind of acts as an affirmation of your current path and your ingrained sense of self for better or for worse. However, while this transit or synastry connection does validate the Libra anti-vertex, this illuminated focus on the other or, balancing the scales could create an opposition to your Aries vertex. And then over time, this comfortable familiarization could act as the domino that eventually, though not always, leads to a fated vertex trigger. But when a transit or synastry person hits the vertex directly, the fated destination could bring an unexpected reroute much more directly. And this contact could illuminate your blind spots and force you to see a completely new perspective in some way. And the change drops into your lap, maybe outright bringing events or people that could change your trajectory for better or for worse, such as a sudden need for independent action, or maybe a fast paced crisis that requires, decision making, while you're just simply going about your routine anti-vertex mediating pursuits. And so that's what the energy brings for an Aries vertex. If you want to know specifically more about what to expect, go down to the timestamps and look for the house placement of your vertex and anti-vertex. And for now, let's go to the next sign. If you have a Taurus vertex, then this timestamp is for you. And so to understand this placement, we must separate the house from the sign, because your house placement shows the literal area of life that could receive this change or the fated moments. But the sign of Taurus reveals the how, the energetic tone, and the flavor of maybe the fated encounter. And so to see the specific mechanics of this event, locate Venus, which is the ruler of Taurus, in your birth chart, because that can kind of give you a hint as to how this is delivered. And so with the Taurus vertex, the fated course corrections in your life could carry a steady, methodical, and grounded trajectory. The resulting encounter could introduce a scenario that roots maybe you firmly to the tangible earth, marked by patience and the preservation of resources in some way. And this result could be literal, like an event leading you to manage physical property or to maintain strict physical routines in your life, but this result could also be very energetic as well, where the shift encourages a recalibration of your nervous system, prioritizing stillness and material simplicity and the steadiness of that Taurus energy. And so to find that initial setting for this energy, we look to the opposite sign, which is your Scorpio anti-vertex. And the anti-vertex represents your conscious and unconscious baseline. It encompasses your ingrained traits, your active pursuits, and the settings you may naturally put yourself in. And this could act as the first domino in the chain reaction of your Taurus vertex in some way. And so, with a Scorpio anti-vertex, your trigger environment could be driven maybe by your pursuit of investigative power, your desire to go deep beneath the surface, and your drive to derive control for protection in some way. And you could actively position yourself in high-stakes scenarios, dissecting complex truths in your life in some way. And your participation in this intense sphere could act as the pressure cooker. And the environment may eventually respond by introducing a fated catalyst that disrupts this psychological complexity in some way. And the result of this timeline shift is a Taurus outcome, demanding uncomplicated grounding in some way. And so, how to notice that this trigger could be building is that you could notice an intense focus on investigating motives, maybe managing power dynamics, or anticipating a crisis. And this could be accompanied by the realization that maybe you're exhausted by the psychological depth, or maybe you're just dealing with it in general in some way. And then the trigger event will usually arrive circumstantially right as your conscious excavation kind of hits the floor of whatever it is that you're dealing with, opening the door for an event characterized by grounding or material simplicity. And just in case you want to know what this could look like in practice, I will give a few examples just so you understand the dynamic. And so the first example is you could maybe immerse yourself in a high stakes environment, maybe investigating hidden data or managing a psychological crisis. And this active focus could set the stage. Maybe the result of a catalyst event could introduce an energy that is entirely methodical and focused on physical peace, kind of shifting your reality away from survival mode and into something that feels more peaceful in some way. Another example is maybe you could actively focus on dissecting motives or untangling maybe power dynamics, and then a fated event could occur that consists entirely of the tangible world. And so the resulting trajectory could pull you out of the transformative realm and place you right into a space where you are required to build something in order to, establish your safety and security. Another example is you could operate in an environment governed by survival instincts or intense emotional shedding, and that environment may respond by introducing a structural opportunity that does provide steady, predictable comfort. And the result is a shift from the adrenaline of psychological transformation to the methodical pace of physical maintenance in some way. And then another example is you could direct your conscious focus towards the unseen or the psychological or the taboo. And then a literal event involving maybe physical sustenance or material security could present itself. It could be money or resources that kind of fall into your lap that maybe, change your trajectory in some way. And the resulting trajectory is very sensory, maybe marked by a slowing of the body and an engagement with the earth in some way. And then because this is an axis, the energy functions as a loop. So once the environment shifts you into a grounded, methodical tourist destination, you don't have to just passively sit in the mud. Maybe you could consciously use your Scorpio investigative skills to guard that Taurus foundation. But alternatively, you could take the deep stability of the Taurus vertex and then use it to permanently calm the nervous system of your Scorpio baseline, allowing you to engage in psychological work without constantly being in survival mode. And so when a transit hits the anti-vertex or a person enters your life whose planets land here, it will illuminate your focus on control and psychological survival, either directly or indirectly. And this energy could feel highly familiar and comfortable for better or for worse, and it could act as an affirmation of your current path and your ingrained sense of self. However, while this transit or synastry connection validates your Scorpio traits, this illuminated focus could create an opposition to your Taurus vertex, and over time, this comfortable familiarization could act as a domino that eventually, though not always, leads to a fated vertex trigger. But conversely, when a transit or synastry person hits your vertex directly, the fated destination could bring an unexpected reroute much more directly. And this contact could illuminate your blind spots and force you to see a completely new perspective. And the change could drop into your lap, outright bringing events or people that could change your trajectory for better or for worse, such as a sudden demand for patience, a material obligation, or a person representing immovable peace while you're just simply going about your routine investigative pursuits. And so that describes the Taurus vertex. If you want to learn more specifically on how this could look in your real life, I do recommend you go down to the timestamps and then watch for your house placement. But for now, let's go to the next sign. So now we are going to talk about your vertex in Gemini. And so to interpret this correctly, we have to separate the house from the sign because the house dictates the literal area of life that receives the change, but the sign of Gemini reveals the how, the flavor of maybe the event or the energetic reality of the fated encounter. And so for a deeper clue, we have to look at where Mercury, which is the ruler of Gemini, sits in your natal chart. So if you want a hint as to maybe more of how this could come up, do look at your Mercury placement. But with a Gemini vertex, the destined events in your life could carry an energetic trajectory of cleverness, investigative curiosity, and the rapid collection of information. The resulting encounter could introduce a scenario characterized by local facts, mental agility, and the managing of moving parts. And this result could be literal, like an event guiding you into a role that requires maybe coding or coordinating immediate logistics in some way. But this could also be energetic, shifting your trajectory to encourage a breakdown of broad theories into something more localized, into, focusing on the details as opposed to maybe the big picture. And this energy does require an initial setting, obviously, which is where we find your Sagittarius anti-vertex. And so the anti-vertex represents your conscious and unconscious baseline. It encompasses your ingrained traits, your active pursuits, or the literal settings that you naturally put yourself in, and this will act as the initial domino of this dynamic. So with a Sagittarius anti-vertex, your trigger environment could be driven by your pursuit of optimism, expansion, and your eagerness for experiences beyond your current scope. And you could actively operate in a space of overarching philosophies, taking leaps of faith, and avoiding maybe the small details in favor of the grand vision. And your participation in this macro level sphere could act as the pressure cooker. And the environment could eventually respond by introducing a catalyst that disrupts this philosophical trajectory in some way. And the result of this shift is a Gemini outcome, maybe demanding massive logistical data gathering or to focus on what is right in front of you. And so, how to notice this trigger building is you could notice an intense focus on preaching a grand theory, maybe betting on blind faith, or operating on a massive generalization. And this could be accompanied by the realization that maybe you have ignored the instructions or the details or the big pic, or, like the picture that's right in front of you, not the big picture, but the picture right in front of you, because that's more Gemini. And the trigger event usually arrives circumstantially, right as maybe a broad plan or, a broad philosophy, whatever it may be, runs into a mundane logistical roadblock. And so, if you do want to know what this could look like in practice, I will go over a few examples. The first example is maybe you actively defend an overarching truth, operating on a broad assumption to push forward. And this active generalization could set the stage for a catalyst event, and you could encounter a specific undeniable piece of contradictory data. And the result could force a dualistic reality, kind of demanding you gather immediate facts and permanently alter sort of maybe your way of thinking, and this could completely change your trajectory away from that sweeping theory in some way. Another example is you could direct your conscious focus entirely on a grand vision, taking a risk based on pure optimism, and then maybe a circumstantial event could introduce a specific, fast paced logistical variable that kind of breaks your theory, and the resulting trajectory is defined by raw data gathering and figuring out kind of the localized mechanics of what you are working towards. And this kind of changes, your path entirely. Another example is you could build an environment fueled by philosophical exploration, forward momentum, and then maybe a sudden structural shift could occur, introducing a reality marked by fragmented communication. And the fated trajectory could push you off of the grand sort of path and into a busy reality of kind of, learning to juggle the details and communicate more clearly. Another example is you could attach yourself to one massive righteous path forward in some way, and then an event could occur that splits this path, presenting two distinct viable options. And then the result could be a trajectory characterized by maybe mental dexterity, requiring you to actively exchange information to kind of figure out where you need to go rather than just trusting your gut. And so, because this point acts as an axis, the anti-vertex could also be the toolkit you use to process the vertex once it arrives. And so, when the environment shifts into a fragmented, maybe data driven Gemini destination, you don't have to just get lost in the weeds because you could consciously use your Sagittarius traits to integrate it, turning that raw data into wisdom so that you can see the big picture and the details at the same time. Because trust me when I say both are important. But then on the flip side, you could take the localized facts you gathered from the Gemini vertex and bring them back into your Sagittarius baseline using real data to ground your theories or maybe your big picture view. And so when a transit or synastry person hits your anti-vertex, just for example, it could illuminate your macro vision and pursuits of expansion, either directly or indirectly. And this expansive energy could feel highly familiar and comfortable for better or for worse. And this could act as an affirmation of your current path or your ingrained sense of self. However, when this transit or synastry connection validates your Sagittarius traits, the illuminated focus on the horizon could create an opposition to your Gemini vertex. And then over time, this familiarization could act as the domino that eventually, though not always, leads to a fated vertex trigger. Or conversely, maybe when a transit or a person hits your vertex directly, the fated destination could bring an unexpected reroute much more directly. It could, punch you a little bit harder. And this contact could illuminate your blind spot and force you to see a completely new perspective. And the change could drop into your lap, outright bringing events or people that could change your direction for better or for worse, such as a sudden influx of data, a demand for communication, or a literal person embodying a Gemini sort of mindset or a sense of curiosity, just while you're simply going about your Sagittarius expansions, and then both will kind of be affected. And so that is what I want to touch on for the Gemini vertex. If you want to learn more specifically about how this looks for you, I do encourage you to go down to the description and watch your house timestamps. But for now, let's go to the next sign. So now we will be touching on the Cancer vertex and what that means. And so to break this down properly, we have to separate the house from the sign because the house indicates the literal area of life where the change occurs, but the sign of Cancer will explain the how. So the energy, the traits of the people involved, or the flavor of the fated shift in some way. And so for that added layer of insight, look at the placement of the moon or the ruler of Cancer in your natal chart because that can give you more of a hint as to how this fated change could come. And so, with a Cancer vertex, the resulting trajectory of the destined events in your life could center around intuition, empathy, passion, and it derives intelligence directly from the body. That's kind of what the moon and Cancer does for me, and not a lot of people talk about that. But the fated encounter could introduce a scenario that operates entirely on subjective feeling and emotional protection. And so these results could be highly literal, like the event resulting in you caring for a child, securing a home, maybe, dealing with emotional dynamics in your life, or that really touches, your heartstrings in some way. But it could also be energetic, pulling you into a trajectory that does encourage emotional vulnerability and reliance on your gut instincts over raw logic in some way. And so to find the initial setting for these events, we do have to look to your Capricorn anti-vertex because the anti-vertex represents your conscious and unconscious baseline. It encompasses your ingrained traits, your active pursuits, and the literal settings you naturally put yourself in. And this could act as the initial domino for this sequence of events of the fated faded areas of your life. And so with the Capricorn anti-vertex, your trigger environment could be driven by your application of practicality, stoicism, and a focus on security and how you kind of, take on routine or structure in your life. But you could operate in a results oriented space as well, kind of working to build structure or maximize your world by laying one brick after another in some way. Or maybe you find that you have to, even if this doesn't feel like a natural part of you. And your presence in this disciplined, structured realm could act as the pressure cooker. And the environment could eventually respond to this highly practical focus by introducing a catalyst event. And the result of this event could require an emotional, intuitive resolution that logic and structure simply cannot touch. And so, how to notice the trigger building is you could be pouring your focus into managing a responsibility. Maybe you're enduring, something more difficult in your life, and you kind of have to act as a rock for others. Or maybe you're operating strictly through logic, at least in one setting of your life. And then the fated event usually happens circumstantially when a structural goal is achieved or when the environment reaches a limit in some way, opening the door for an emotional break. And so, if you want to know what this could look like in practice, I will go over a few broad examples. And so, the first example is you could operate in a demanding practical environment, consciously utilizing traits of disciplined or delayed gratification in some way. And this structure will set the stage. Maybe you could encounter someone or something whose nature requires immediate instinctual care and protection. And the result of this shift could guide you to step back from the rigid structure to cultivate a soft, emotionally safe space. Another example is you could consciously consume yourself with a timeline or a strict set of realistic rules to maximize your world. Maybe you're feeling a little bit, limited by the world. And then a sudden event could occur where logic and rules simply don't apply, such as an unpredictable emotional crisis or just an emotional sense of inspiration. And the resulting trajectory is an experience that could need to be navigated entirely through gut feeling and visceral passion because nothing else will seem to work. Another example is you can navigate a scenario by asserting mature authority, consciously carrying the weight of a situation alone to ensure results. Maybe you kind of have to be self reliant, and then an event could occur that pierces this armor, such as an encounter with a deeply nostalgic setting or a person. And this fated trajectory could introduce a reality where the primary currency becomes emotional vulnerability in some way. Another example is you could build an environment where success is strictly equated with endurance, time management, and measurable output. And then a fated encounter could introduce a scenario that proves that maybe your structural system has failed, and the resulting trajectory could demand empathy, providing comfort, and operating entirely from the heart to survive. Like maybe the shell that you have to wear isn't enough in some way. And so, because this mechanic operates as a continuous loop, your Capricorn anti-vertex could become the toolkit you use to navigate the Cancer vertex. So, when the environment brings a demanding emotional situation, a requirement for vulnerability, or a highly intuitive scenario kind of into your lap, you don't have to just drown in the feelings because you can deploy your Capricorn traits or settings or experiences to handle it and use your capacity for structure to build a safe, secure container for that fragile emotion to exist. Conversely, you could take the emotional intelligence gained from the Cancer vertex and bring it back to your Capricorn baseline, ensuring that the structures you build are fueled by empathy and human connection. And for some reason, that could make it that much more stronger. And so when a transit or a synastry person hits your anti-vertex, it illuminates your structural, results-oriented matters into focus, either directly or indirectly. And this energy could feel highly familiar or comfortable for better or for worse. And it could act as an affirmation of your current path or your ingrained sense of self. However, while this transit or synastry could validate your Capricorn traits in some way, this illuminated focus on reality could create an opposition to your Cancer vertex, and over time, this comfortable familiarization could act as the domino that eventually, but not always, leads to a fated vertex trigger. But conversely, when a transit or synastry person hits your vertex directly, the fated destination could bring an unexpected reroute much more directly. And this contact could illuminate your blind spots and force you to see a completely new perspective. And the change could drop into your lap, outright bringing events or people that change your trajectory for better or for worse, such as a sudden intuitive flash, a massive requirement for empathy, or a literal person demanding care or kind of inspiring that within you, restructuring your reality while you're just simply going about your, Capricorn life in some way. And so that describes the Cancer vertex. If you want to know more specifically about how this can look, I do recommend you go down to the description and look for your house timestamp. But for now, let's go to the next sign. And so now we will be talking about the Leo vertex. So to interpret this placement accurately, we have to separate your house from your sign because the house will dictate the literal area of life that will receive this shift, which some people will say is more specific or maybe that matters more. But the sign of Leo will reveal the how or the specific energy, the flavor of the fated encounter, or the traits of the people involved in some way. So to understand exactly how this plays out, locate the sun in your birth chart because this rules Leo, because this could give more of a hint as to where or how this could come up. And so, with a Leo vertex, the fated course corrections in your life could carry an energetic trajectory of expression, creativity, virtuousness, confidence, radiating light in your own way, of course. And the resulting encounter could introduce a scenario characterized by maybe subjective passion, taking center stage, and heart led decisions, or just, affirming who you are. And the results could be very literal, like an event bringing you into the spotlight, a passionate romance, or acting as a central leader of a group. But this result could be very energetic as well, where the shift pushes you to abandon collective logic and operate entirely on your own subjective warmth in some way. And so, to activate this energy, we have to look at the initial setting. The trigger is found exactly opposite of your vertex in your Aquarius anti-vertex. Now, the anti-vertex really represents your conscious and unconscious baseline, and it encompasses your ingrained traits, your active pursuits, and the settings you could naturally be a part of or maybe put yourself in. And this could act as the initial domino for the sequence of events that are kind of fated in your life. So, with an Aquarius anti vertex, your baseline circumstances could be driven by your focus on existential logic, observing from an outside point of view, walking to the beat of your own drum, or trying to, I think Aquarius is a sign that likes to make things better. It could be also a setting where you kind of have to, manage the moving parts and systems of your life, but you could also be actively utilizing traits of innovation, focusing on the future, and maintaining a bird's eye view of, the goal at hand. And your conscious assertion of this logical system will act as the mechanism for, the sequence of events. And the environment could eventually respond to these highly detached actions by introducing a catalyst that disrupts the logic entirely. And the result of this shift could alter your trajectory, placing you onto a path where pure, radiant, subjective passion becomes the new focus in some way. And so, how to notice this trigger building is you could be in a phase of maybe conscious objectivity. You could be analyzing a system, maintaining a polite but emotionally detached distance from a situation, or strictly prioritizing the collective rules over the individual desires. And then this active, detached trajectory could build until maybe the environment introduces an event that kind of shifts, your path in a way that is completely unexpected. And if you want to know what this could look like in practice, I will give a few examples. One example is maybe you could operate in an environment of intellectual detachment, maybe treating a situation as a social experiment, a logical puzzle, or you're just kind of a part of, you're like a cog in the machine, if that makes sense. And this alignment could set the stage because you could cross paths with someone or something that sparks an immediate, dramatic, or maybe a logical emotional response or an expression. And the result of this could move you out of the objective theory and into a space of highly personal, expressive warmth in some way. You no longer feel like a cog in that machine. Another example is you could be focused on maybe being a part of a system or innovating it or observing the status quo from the outside, or maybe you just blend in some way. And then a fated event could occur that kind of singles you out, and the result could alter your trajectory, bypassing collective logic entirely and placing you in an environment defined by courage and taking center stage. Another example is you could be navigating, broad social concepts, social media, existential rules, or you could be consciously maintaining an emotionally cool environment in some way. And then circumstances could change, introducing scenarios defined by more playfulness, artistic creation, romance, and the resulting trajectory could replace kind of this cool detachment with a radiating subjective joy, kind of encouraging you to engage with your heart a little bit more. Another example is you could prioritize the collective good. You could use your traits to maintain a firm, futuristic outsider perspective, and then an event could occur that shatters the systemic rules. And the result of this could introduce a situation dominated by a glowing heart rather than a brilliant mind, kind of characterized by personal desires and unapologetic expression in some way. And then, because this axis is a continuous feedback loop, the Aquarius anti-vertex could be exactly how you manage that Leo destination once you arrive there. So, when the environment shifts you into the center of the spotlight, or into your heart, or into a creative endeavor, or a romance, whatever it could be, you don't just have to blindly burn up in the heat, because you could actively use your traits of existential observation and kind of a futuristic mindset to guide that Leo fire. Or you could take that radiant joy of the Leo vertex and bring it back to your Aquarius baseline, using your personal warmth to inspire and breathe life into whatever it is that you're building. And so when a transit or synastry person hits your anti-vertex, it illuminates your logical, kind of detached outside point of view into focus, either directly or indirectly. And so this energy could feel highly familiar and comfortable, for better or for worse. And this could act as an affirmation of your current path and your ingrained sense of self in some way. However, while this transit or the synastry connection could validate your Aquarius traits, this illuminated focus on the observation of, the systems in your life could create an opposition to your Leo vertex. So over time, this comfortable familiarization could act as the domino that eventually, though not always, leads to a fated vertex trigger. Conversely, though, when a transit or synastry person hits your vertex directly, the fated destination could bring an unexpected route much more directly, much more punchily, if that's a word. I don't know if it is. I don't think it is. Anyway, this contact could illuminate your blind spots and force you to see a completely new perspective, one that kind of centers on you, your confidence, how you express yourself. And the change could drop into your lap, outright bringing maybe events or people that change your trajectory for better or for worse, such as a demand for creative expression, a surge of personal passion and increasing confidence, or a literal person embodying that center stage, kind of restructuring your life just while you're simply existing within your routine Aquarius pursuits in some way. And so that describes the Leo vertex. I know you probably want to know what this could look like on a more detailed level. I do recommend you go down to the description and look for your house timestamps, because that will give you a bigger picture on what this could look like for you. Now we will be talking about the Virgo vertex, and to fully grasp this placement, we must separate the sign from the house because they are different. The house placement will be more specific because it will outline the literal area of life that receives this destiny, but the sign of Virgo will outline the how, the energy, the exact tone, or the traits of the fated encounters, or the people, or the events. And so to see the specific mechanics of this and to get a hint more as to what this could look like, I would locate where Mercury, which is the ruler of Virgo, is in your natal chart, because this could give you a bit more insight into what this could look like. And so, with a Virgo vertex, the resulting trajectory of the destined events in your life could carry an energy of detail, critical analysis, and practical, thoughtful application. And so, the fated encounter could introduce a scenario characterized by breaking things down into component parts, fixing what is broken, or establishing a highly functional system in some way. And the destination could be highly literal, like an event leading you to manage a strict set of data, organizing a workspace, or applying a tangible health protocol, or even, just being of service in some way. But it doesn't have to be this way because the result could also be energetic, placing you onto a trajectory that encourages discernment and a removal of excess to survive, to focusing on what truly matters. But these fated events require a trigger, and so the trigger is located opposite of the vertex in your Pisces anti-vertex. So the anti-vertex represents your conscious and unconscious baseline. It encompasses your ingrained traits, your active pursuits, or the literal settings you could naturally put yourself in, and this will act as the initial domino of this dynamic in some way. And so, with a Pisces anti vertex, your conscious setting could be focused purely on acting as an energetic or creative sponge. Maybe you're very open, and you could be applying your traits to absorb the world through osmosis, taking in your environment very easily, and tapping into realms that understand human nature from like an existential level. And you could operate in a space where logic dissolves and fluidity rules. And when your conscious focus becomes so saturated by this environment, a catalyst event could occur. And the result of this could be a fated trajectory shift that could require you to implement more real world discernment, detail, and analysis into your life. Or it could bring you, a fact or a piece of data that completely changes how you relate to the world. And so, how to notice this trigger building is you could be pouring your focus into a massive phase of pure absorption. Maybe you're navigating emotionally overwhelming spaces, existing in an imaginative mindset, or letting boundaries dissolve entirely. And this trigger event usually could occur circumstantially when your conscious absorption reaches a threshold or the environment begins to unravel, but this could come out of nowhere as well. And so, just for a few examples on the dynamic, just so you can visualize this more, and just as a note, the house placement will be more specific. This is just how the energy may move. Just for examples, you could apply your energy to navigate a highly fluid, emotionally nebulous situation. You could utilize traits that absorb the atmosphere without defining it. And this could hit a point of total saturation, and this could act as a catalyst event. And the result of this shift could place you in a Virgo trajectory where you're kind of pushed to encounter an energy of crisp, analytical, grounded practicality. You got to look at the variables now. And this fated encounter could act as the mechanism that categorizes what's going on around you. Another example is you could entrench yourself heavily in unconditional empathy, looking at a situation through a deeply idealistic, boundless lens in some way. And this active focus could set the stage for an event. Maybe a glaring error or a mechanical flaw is revealed in some way. And the result of this shift could destroy an illusion, placing you in a period of critical analysis and requiring you to practically fix the problem. Another example is you could direct your focus to, go with the flow more, maybe relying entirely on your ability to absorb information through osmosis and avoiding hard definitions. And then this active fluidity could set the stage. Maybe the result of a timeline shift could completely alter your trajectory, pulling you into environments consisting of highly specific, complex logistical puzzles, kind of replacing that drifting energy with a need to microscopically edit what is around you because that will, for some reason, give you better results. Another example is you could focus all of your conscious actions on unfiltered creative or emotional output, and you could fully tap into human nature. But a circumstantial event could occur that drops a highly strict scenario into your life. And this result could be a massive requirement for refinement, moving you onto a trajectory where you may need to prune away the excess. You may need to focus on the details, analyze the data, and build a highly functional system out of the chaos because for some reason, maybe this is needed in some way. And then because the axis operates on a cyclical loop, your Pisces anti-vertex could act as a toolkit that you use to navigate the Virgo vertex. And so when the environment plunges you into a period of microscopic detail or rigid analysis or the heavy burden of fixing what is broken, you don't have to coldly edit a situation. You could consciously rely on your Pisces traits to endure it and then apply your skills of empathy or osmosis to inform your analysis. Alternatively, though, you could take a critical discernment of a Virgo vertex and what you learn, like the details you learn, and bring it back to that Pisces baseline, using it to clean out maybe emotional environments that, need a little bit of cleaning and to create healthy boundaries within your spiritual or open practices. And so when a transit or synastry person hits the anti-vertex, it illuminates your fluid, absorbent reality into focus, either directly or indirectly. And this energy could feel highly familiar and comfortable for better or for worse. And this could act as an affirmation of your current path or your ingrained sense of self. However, while this transit or synastry connection could validate the Pisces part of your life, this focus on the undefined could create an opposition to your Virgo vertex. And over time, this comfortable familiarization could act as the domino that eventually, though not always, leads to a vertex trigger. But conversely, when a transit or person hits your vertex directly, the fated destination could bring an unexpected reroute a lot more directly. It could, slap you in the face a little bit harder, although not literally. But the contact illuminates maybe your blind spots and forces you to see a completely new perspective. Like maybe there's a detail you received that changes the entirety of how you view that Pisces part of your life. And the change could drop directly into your lap outright, bringing events or people that change your life for better or for worse. It could bring a logistical puzzle, a demand for editing, or a literal person that kind of brings out that practical side of you, altering your trajectory while you are simply just operating within your routine Pisces fluid pursuits. And this could come in many ways. But if you do want to know specifically what this could look like more, I do recommend going down to the timestamps and looking for your house placements, because that will give you a lot more deeper insight. And so that covers it for the Virgo vertex. And so let's go on to the next sign. So now let's talk about the Libra vertex. And so to interpret this correctly, we have to distinguish between your sign and your house, because your house placement tells us the literal area of life that receives the change. But the sign of Libra reveals the how, maybe the personality traits or the flavor or the energetic style of your destined encounters. And so for the deeper story, locate where Venus is placed in your natal chart, because that'll give you a clue kind of how this could come to you. And so a Libra vertex dictates that the resulting trajectory of your fated course corrections or your encounters could carry an energy of equilibrium, balance, fairness, mediation, and understanding the world strictly through the lens of others. And the fated encounters could include a scenario characterized by the weighing of scales, kind of using the world as one end of the scale and yourself at the other. So maybe nuanced negotiation and mandatory symmetry are themes that come up. And this destination can manifest in highly literal ways, such as an event resulting in signaling a formal partnership, or maybe entering a mediation sort of setting, maybe a literal marriage, or just something where maybe balance is restored in your life, kind of outside of your control. But it could just as easily become maybe an energetic outcome where the events shift you away from unilateral decision making in favor of careful compromise. However, to kind of like understand how this energy is activated, we have to look at the trigger, because the trigger could be found exactly opposite this point in your Aries anti-vertex. And the anti-vertex represents your conscious and unconscious baseline. It encompasses your ingrained traits, your active pursuits, and the literal settings you may be naturally a part of in some way. And this could act as the initial domino that falls in your fate, so to speak. And so within Aries anti-vertex, your active conscious reality could be highly instinctual in some way. So you could maybe be applying your traits to move forward quickly, or to move forward, without getting stuck in deliberation. Maybe you utilize action-oriented energy in your own way, of course, or you could be in a setting where you're relying on pure instinct to navigate in general. And so your repetitive participation in this maybe fast-paced or instinctual or solo energy could set the stage for the Libra, encounter to unfold in some way. And so maybe a catalyst event could occur within this independent sphere. And the result of this event could spark a massive deceleration, maybe altering your trajectory by pulling you out of your unilateral focus and encouraging a reality of balance or deliberation or establishing harmony in some way. And so, how to notice this trigger building is you could be actively pouring your focus into a tight loop of action. Maybe you're fighting for a cause, or you're just charging forward with a goal in some way. And you could be utilizing traits that keep you structurally confined to your own momentum. And then this trigger event almost always could maybe occur, a little bit circumstantially during maybe the peak of a fast paced exertion, or when you're kind of in the heat or the action of maybe a circumstance in your life. And so, if you want to know what this could look like in practice, I will give a few examples, but note your house placement will probably tell you more specifics. And so the first example is maybe you could consciously engage in quick or instinctual action or utilize your action oriented traits to overcome obstacles, maybe independently. And this momentum could act as a catalyst event, maybe pushing you to a plateau where solo force no longer works. And the result of this shift could place you on a brand new trajectory, maybe introducing someone or something whose energy asks for graceful accommodation and finding the middle ground. Another example is you could maybe plan and embark on a quick, unfiltered, execution of an idea. You could focus entirely on getting a task done, regardless of how it looks or affects others. You just want to get the thing done. And this active movement could set a stage for maybe a disruption. And the result of navigating that disruption in some way could permanently alter your trajectory, maybe pulling you into an environment defined by, aesthetic design or refinement and slowing of the pace to create harmony in some way. Another example is you could actively focus on maybe maintaining, physical energy. You could be in a setting that is, you're very reactive in, or there could be a lot of forward momentum in general. And then an event could occur that halts this physical movement in some way. And the result could instantly redirect your trajectory from solo action towards more intellectual debate or weighing the scales, characterized by the evaluation of multiple sides and a complete suspension of raw reaction. And then another dynamic, just to get you thinking, is maybe you could consciously assert your own will over your environment and act on instinct, and your participation in this momentum could act as the initial event, and the result could introduce a highly complex scenario involving maybe competing interests, moving you onto a trajectory where you could need to engage in objective mediation, diplomacy, and the design of a fair compromise. And maybe because you have to do this, it completely alters your direction in a fated way. And because this functions as a two-way loop, the Aries anti-vertex could be exactly how you process the massive shifts of the Libra vertex. And so maybe once the environment brings a macro level Libra destination, like entering a partnership, mediating a conflict, or designing a shared compromise, you don't have to simply become completely passive. You could use the Aries traits to ground that. You could consciously apply your action-oriented energy or your forward-moving momentum or your courage to establish boundaries within that compromise. Alternatively, though, you could take the deep lessons of harmony and equilibrium you found in that Libra vertex and bring them back to your Aries baseline, ensuring that your independent pursuits and solo drives are finally fueled by fairness and balance rather than just brute force. And so when a transit or synastry person hits your anti-vertex, it illuminates your instinctual action-oriented momentum in some way. It brings that energy kind of into focus, either directly or indirectly. And this forward-moving energy could feel very familiar or comfortable, for better or for worse. This will obviously depend on your Mars sign, and it can act as an affirmation of your current path and your ingrained sense of self. However, while this transit or synastry connection could validate the Aries side of maybe your fate in some way, this illuminated focus on the self could inherently create an opposition to your Libra vertex. And then over time, this comfortable familiarization could act as the domino that eventually, though not always, leads to a fated vertex trigger. But conversely, though, when a transit or synastry person hits the vertex directly, the fated destination could bring an unexpected reroute much more directly. It could kind of hit you a little bit, harder, if that makes sense. And this contact could illuminate your blind spots and force you to see a completely new perspective in some way. And the change could almost feel like it drops in your lap, outright bringing events or people that could change your trajectory for better or for worse, such as a sudden demand for mediation, a massive requirement for balance, or even a literal person, kind of encouraging an immediate trajectory shift while you're just simply engaging in your routine Aries forward movement. And so that is kind of the baseline energy for how a Libra vertex would be defined. And so if you want to figure out more specifics, do go down to the description and look for your house timestamps. But for now, let's go on to the next sign. Now let's talk about the Scorpio vertex. And so to understand this placement, we must differentiate between your sign and your house because the house outlines the literal area of life that could receive this change and may give you a bit of a more specific outline as to how this event could show up. But the sign of Scorpio will dictate the how, the energetic flavor, the psychological depth, and the intense characteristics of the fated encounters in some way. And so, to understand the specifics, I would find Pluto and Mars in your natal chart, see where those are placed, because those can give you a hint as to how this can play out as well. And so, a Scorpio vertex dictates that the fated course corrections or, fated trajectories in your life could carry an energy of intense investigation, power dynamics, and going beneath the surface to derive control in some way. And the fated encounter could introduce a scenario maybe defined by crisis management, psychological unearthing, or navigating the taboo in some way. And this destination could be a literal manifestation, like maybe being forced to kind of, manage very deep things in life. Maybe you're navigating an audit of, the power dynamics of your life, or you're even dealing with an intense power struggle in some way. But this could also be a non literal manifestation, maybe pulling you into an overarching energetic trajectory that could demand deep emotional shedding and psychological transformation just to navigate the shift. But the vertex does require kind of a trigger. It requires, a counterbalance. And so to find that, we look at the opposite side of your chart, which is your Taurus anti-vertex. And the anti-vertex kind of represents your conscious and unconscious baseline. It encompasses maybe the ingrained traits, your active pursuits, and the literal settings you could be put in while this fated encounter happens. And this in some way could act as the initial domino of your fated encounters. So with the Taurus anti-vertex, your initial trigger could be driven by your pursuit of steady, methodical pacing, maybe grounded routines, or rooting yourself in the earth in some way. And you could be consciously operating within environments defined by the preservation of physical status quo, material comfort, or stillness, or maybe you're being stubborn in some cases. And your active presence in this heavily grounded realm could act as a pressure cooker because the environment could eventually respond to this slow physical focus by introducing a catalyst event. And so the result of this event could require a highly complex, psychologically demanding resolution that disrupts the stillness entirely. Like maybe you got to get to the root of the issue and it won't go away until you do that. And so, how to notice this trigger building is you could be actively seeking environments that require stillness, or you could be pouring your focus into managing pure sensory input or physical routines. You could be trying to ground yourself in some way. And this intense self directed focus on the tangible could eventually reach a threshold in some way, manifesting circumstantially as maybe stagnation. And this could be your environment signaling that a transformative event is imminent, but not always. It could just come out of nowhere as well. And so, if you want some examples on how this could look, I will give a few, but just note that the house manifestation will be a little bit more literal because the sign, like I said, that's just the energetic signature. And so, one example is you could choose a period of intense, maybe material preservation. You could be actively applying your traits to build a safe, predictable, and physically comforting environment in some way. And this focus on the tangible could set the stage for a catalyst event. You could encounter someone or something whose energy is penetrating and maybe focused on power. And the result of this event could alter your trajectory, encouraging a shift from simple physical comfort into a space of deep psychological exploration. Like maybe somebody encourages you to heal or something encourages you to heal. Another example is there could be a period of consciously holding on to a specific physical reality. You could be moving slowly and prioritizing preservation in some way, and this could reach a limit. So maybe an event could occur, such as a sudden revelation of a secret or a shift in a power dynamic that forces a circumstantial disruption. And the resulting trajectory could pull you out of your comfort zone and place you into an environment characterized by navigating a crisis and allowing a psychological death and rebirth to occur. occur. Another example is maybe while you could be directing your energy entirely towards the visible, the tangible, and what is pleasant, a circumstantial shift could occur. And the result of navigating that shift could introduce a mandatory, highly complex scenario defined by investigative research or uncomfortable taboo subjects. And this could replace the beautiful surface with an excavation of the complete roots beneath them in some way. Another example is you could spend years in a state of slow, methodical patience, maybe consciously grazing through life at your own pace, and then maybe a circumstantial shift or a fated encounter could act as the catalyst, and this could result in maybe a pull out of the slow lane, moving you onto a trajectory that asks for obsession or investigative focus and the navigation of deep emotional undercurrents in some way. And so, because this mechanic operates as a continuous loop, your Taurus anti-vertex could become the exact toolkit that you do use to navigate the Scorpio vertex. And so, when the environment brings a massive psychological crisis or a power dynamic or a demand for transformation, you don't have to just be swept away by the intensity because you could consciously deploy your Taurus traits to handle it, using your capacity for steady, methodical grounding to physically endure the psychological storm. But conversely, though, you could take the deep psychological transformations of the Scorpio vertex and bring that depth back to your Taurus baseline, ensuring that the physical reality and material comforts you build are no longer superficial but deeply meaningful. And so, when a transit or synastry person hits the anti-vertex specifically, it could illuminate your material, grounded matters into focus, either directly or indirectly. And this steady energy could feel highly familiar and comfortable for better or for worse. And it can act as an affirmation of your current path and your ingrained sense of self in some way. However, while this transit or synastry connection could validate your Taurus traits in some way, or the setting, this illuminated focus on the surface could create an opposition to your Scorpio vertex, and then over time, this comfortable familiarization could act as the domino that eventually, though not always, leads to a fated vertex trigger. But conversely, though, when a transit or synastry person hits your vertex directly, the fated destination could bring an unexpected reroute much more directly. It could, hit you a little bit harder. And this contact could illuminate your blind spots and force you to see a completely new perspective. And the change could feel like it drops in your lap, outright bringing events or people that change your trajectory for better or for worse, such as a sudden crisis, maybe a demand for investigation, alchemy, or even a literal person just exuding powerful Scorpio energy, which will instantly restructure your reality just while you're going about your routine, grounded Taurus pursuits, because it will inevitably affect both. But you probably want to know more specifically how this will look. I do have timestamps for the houses down in the description. I do recommend you watch that. But for now, that is it for the Scorpio vertex. Let's move on to the next sign. Now let's talk about the Sagittarius vertex, which is what I have as well. And so I probably know about this one a little bit more than the rest. Hint, hint. So you might be getting some tea here. Although what I will say is that we do need to separate the sign from the house, because the sign of the vertex just reveals the how, kind of the personality traits, the flavor, or the energy of this encounter. But your house placement will show us the area of life that receives this change, which some people will say that's more tea. You can watch that timestamp after this one. Anyway, when the vertex is in Sagittarius, the resulting trajectory of your fated encounters could be heavily expansive. And the timeline shifts in your life could maybe place you in a destination defined by optimism, expanding beyond your current scope in some way, and an eagerness for new experiences. And this can be very highly literal, such as an event resulting in maybe you traveling or pursuing higher education, interacting with foreigners, doing something that teaches you something on a grand scale. But it doesn't have to be literal. Sometimes the result is purely energetic, shifting you onto a trajectory where you could adopt an overarching philosophy or take a massive leap of faith without physically moving. However, a vertex event is usually a reaction to a trigger, and that trigger is found directly across the chart in your Gemini anti-vertex. And that anti-vertex represents your conscious and unconscious baseline. It encompasses the ingrained traits, the active pursuits, and the literal settings you will be put in regarding your fate in some way, and this could act as the initial domino regarding your fated encounters in some way. And so, with a Gemini anti-vertex, your baseline circumstance could be driven by your focus on cleverness, investigative data gathering, and the localized exchange of information. And so, you could be utilizing traits of mental dexterity, juggling puzzle pieces, and asking immediate questions. And your conscious assertion of the localized facts could act as the mechanism, and the environment could respond to these fragmented, detail oriented actions by introducing a catalyst that disrupts this data in some way. And the result of this shift could alter your trajectory, placing you onto a path maybe where singular vision, overarching truth, and macro level expansion becomes the new focus. And so, in other words, this could open your eyes. And so, how to notice the trigger building is you could be in a phase of conscious mental activity. You could be rapidly gathering information, jumping from one idea to the next, or utilizing your traits to manage multiple small options at once without drawing conclusions. And this fragmented trajectory could build until the environment introduces an event that maybe shifts your path in some way and that opens your eyes. And so, if you want a few examples on what this could look like, I'll give a few just so you can understand the energy, but just know that the house will be a bit more specific. And so, one example is you could pour your energy into a fragmented routine. You could focus on gathering immediate data or asking questions. And this active data gathering could set the stage. Maybe an event could occur. You could cross paths with somebody who brings a definitive philosophical or optimistic perspective. And the result of this encounter could change your trajectory entirely, introducing a reality where scattered facts are replaced by the pursuit of grand meaning. This is kind of how it happened for me, if you do remember my story from my intro. Another example is you could apply your focus to navigate a scenario by looking at every possible angle, keeping your options open, and processing dual data streams. And this mental juggling could act as the catalyst event itself when you hit a wall of indecision. And the result of this event could completely alter your trajectory, placing you in an environment characterized by a spirit of risk and taking a massive leap of faith, maybe in one distinct direction. Another example is you could prioritize logic, analyzing immediate facts, and consciously treating everything as a temporary, localized curiosity. And this focus could set the stage. Maybe an event could occur that introduces an experience that is deep and unexplainable by simple facts. And the resulting trajectory could replace the localized data points with the mandatory development in some way of a personal overarching belief system, like maybe it changes the way you view the world entirely. Another example is that you could assert your mental flexibility to manage a highly dualistic environment in some way, or you could easily change your mind based on the latest information you gather. And then an event could occur that introduces a universal truth or a moral imperative. And the result of this event is that the overarching vision could completely take over, leaving the mental gymnastics behind and acting as a defining curriculum of your life. And so, because this axis acts as a continuous feedback loop, the Gemini anti-vertex could be exactly how you manage the Sagittarius destination once you arrive there. And so, when the environment brings a massive overarching philosophy, a global expansion, a huge leap of faith, you don't have to just blindly float away on pure optimism. You could actively use your Gemini traits of cleverness, investigative curiosity, and data exchange to ground that massive vision, translating it into digestible information. On the flip side, though, you could take the macro level wisdom you've gained from the Sagittarius vertex and bring it back to elevate your Gemini baseline, ensuring that your conversations or data gathering finally has a deep and meaningful purpose. And so, when a transit or a synastry person hits your anti vertex, it illuminates your mental dexterity and data gathering into focus, either directly or indirectly. And this localized energy could feel highly familiar and comfortable, for better or for worse. And this could act as an affirmation of your current path and your ingrained sense of self in some way. However, while this transit or synastry connection could validate the Gemini side of your life in some way, this illuminated focus on the details could create an opposition to your Sagittarius vertex. And then over time, this comfortable familiarization could act as the domino that eventually, though not always, leads to a fated vertex trigger. But conversely, when a transit or synastry person hits your vertex directly, the fated destination brings an unexpected reroute much more directly. And this contact could illuminate your blind spots and force you to see a completely new perspective. And the change kind of drops into your lab hour, bringing events or people that could change your trajectory for better or worse, such as maybe bringing you a demand for a leap of faith, maybe bringing you a massive surge of optimism, or maybe it could be a literal visionary who comes into your sphere and it kind of restructures your life and makes you question the meaning of it while you're just simply existing within your routine Gemini investigative pursuits. And so that is how the Sagittarius vertex could show up. If you want more specifics, I do recommend going down to the timestamps and looking for your house placement. But for now, let's go on to the next sign. And so now let's talk about the Capricorn vertex. And to fully grasp this placement, we must first separate the sign from the house because the sign of your vertex outlines the how, the energy, the tone, and the flavor of the fated encounters. But the house placement will dictate the actual area of life that receives this change. And so that might be a bit more specific, but the sign is still important to understand the nature. So, with a Capricorn vertex, the resulting trajectory of the destined events of your life could revolve around heavy practicality, an intense focus on security, results oriented action, and the stoic building of structure in some way. And the destination could be highly literal, like an event resulting in maybe taking on a massive leadership role, building a business, or assuming a heavy structural responsibility in your life in some way. But it doesn't have to be literal because the result could also be a purely energetic shift, placing you onto a trajectory that could encourage extreme stoicism and the delayed gratification of your desires to maximize your world. It's like you have to invest in what you're doing in order to yield the results in some way. But these fated events do require a trigger or a counterbalance, and that trigger could be located opposite of the vertex in your Cancer anti-vertex. And so the anti-vertex represents your conscious and unconscious baseline. It encompasses the ingrained traits or the pursuits or the literal settings you could be put into or involved in when it comes to your fated encounters in some way, and it kind of acts as the initial domino. And so, with a Cancer anti vertex, your conscious setting could be focused on intuition, empathy, passion, and deriving intelligence from your body and your gut feelings. You could be applying your traits to create emotional safety, maybe nurture your environment, or operate from a highly subjective lens. And so, when your conscious focus becomes secured around subjective feelings and emotional protection, a catalyst event could occur. And the result of this event could be a fated trajectory shift that could push you to abandon your gut reactions in favor of maybe cold, harder practical structure. And I know this could sound scary, but when you achieve this kind of balance, it's the ultimate axis of security. And so, how to notice that this trigger could be building is that you could be pouring your focus into a massive phase of pure feeling. You could be managing the emotional atmosphere, building a safe, energetic cocoon, or actively using your traits to protect something fragile in some way. And then a trigger event could occur circumstantially when your conscious emotional baseline hits a wall of physical reality, or there could just be a demand in some way that almost comes out of nowhere. And this could happen in your environment and seemingly pull you onto a new path. And so, if you want examples on what this could look like in practice, I'll provide a few. And so, one example is you could consciously apply your energy to operate in a highly sensitive, emotionally fluctuating environment. You could be reacting intuitively to everything around you. And hitting a specific threshold of this emotional saturation could act as a catalyst event. You could encounter a scenario or a person bringing an energy of grounded, stoic practicality. And the result of this shift could place you in a Capricorn trajectory where you are structurally encouraged to shift the reality from subjective feelings to results oriented facts. Another example is you could entrench yourself heavily almost in emotional safety and consciously relying on your gut intelligence to protect something. And this active focus could set the stage for an event, such as a circumstantial requirement for tangible output. And the results of this shift could dissolve the emotional cocoon, placing you in a period of heavy structural reality, requiring you to navigate a timeline or shoulder a burden or a temporary suspension of emotions in some way. Another example is you could maybe build an environment governed entirely by gut feelings and a desire to nurture, relying on your empathetic traits. And this could set the stage for an event. Maybe the result of this timeline shift could alter your direction in some way. It could pull you into an environment characterized by discipline, the mastery of a skill, and delayed gratification. Another example is that maybe you could focus all of your actions on creating unconditional emotional bonds and relying on caretaking in some way. And then a circumstantial event could occur that proves emotional care is not a physically viable solution to the problem at hand, and the result can be a massive shift that pulls you out of your feeling state and moves you onto a trajectory characterized by the implementation of rules and authority in some way. Like maybe you got to shoulder more responsibility to get things done. And because this axis operates as a cyclical loop, your Cancer anti-vertex could act as the toolkit that you use to navigate the Capricorn vertex. So when the environment plunges you into a period of structural pressure, responsibility, or laying something down brick by brick, you don't have to just become completely detached or cold or lose touch of life and, get rid of all of the fun. You could consciously rely on your Cancer traits to endure it or to make it better. Maybe you could apply your skills of intuition to ensure that your structure is actually providing true safety from a dualistic perspective. Conversely, though, you could take the incredible discipline and mastery gained from the Capricorn vertex and bring it back to that Cancerian baseline, using those practical tools to finally build a permanent, kind of unshakable structure in your life that allows for emotional vulnerability and protection and safety while also getting stuff done at the same time. And so when a transit or synastry person hits your anti-vertex, it could illuminate your emotional, intuitive reality, either directly or indirectly. And this subjective energy could feel highly familiar and comfortable for better or for worse. And this can act as an affirmation of your current path and your ingrained sense of self. However, while this transit or synastry connection could validate the Cancer part of your life in some way, this focus on subjectivity could create an opposition to the Capricorn vertex. So, over time, this familiarization can act as the domino that eventually, though not always, leads to a fated vertex trigger. But conversely, though, when a transit or person hits your vertex directly, the fated destination could bring an unexpected reroute much more directly. It'll kind of punch a little bit harder. And this contact could illuminate your blind spots and force you to see a completely new perspective. And the change can feel like it drops into your lap, maybe bringing events or people that change your direction for better or for worse, such as maybe giving you more responsibility or burden, or maybe there's a massive demand for practical results, or maybe you feel like you want to take responsibility of your life in some way, or maybe there's a literal person that kind of brings out that serious side of you, altering your direction while you're just simply operating within that Cancer intuitive sort of setting in some way. And so, if you want to know more about how this could look, I do recommend you go down to the description and look for your timestamp on the house placement just to get a better idea of, how this can exactly show up. But for now, that's it for the Capricorn vertex. Let's move on to the next sign. And so now let's talk about the Aquarius vertex. And so to interpret this placement correctly, we have to distinguish between your sign and your house because the sign of your vertex reveals the how, maybe the personality traits, the flavor, or the energetic style of those destined encounters. But your house placement will tell us the area of life this receives this change, which could be more specific, but the sign definitely is important to tell us, what to look out for and what that energy could look like. And so, an Aquarius vertex will dictate that the resulting trajectory of your fated course corrections or encounters or your destined events could involve maybe something that makes you have to walk to the beat of your own drum in some way. There could be innovation involved. Maybe you are focusing on future hopes and building the structure around making your life better because that is the Saturnian side of Aquarius energy. And this could help you maybe gain a massive outside point of view or to understand a system better because I associate Aquarius with systems. And this could manifest in highly literal ways, such as an event resulting in you joining maybe an unconventional group for a cause. Maybe you invent a new system, or you experience a sudden flash of technological insight in some way. But it could just as easily be energetic, maybe where the events shift your trajectory into a space of maybe seeing things from a space of emotional detachment, or encouraging you to view your life objectively from the outside, or to understand a system, even if it's not like a literal established system, but just like the mechanism of a system that rules an area of your life. However, to understand how this energy comes about, we have to look at a potential trigger. And this trigger could be found exactly opposite this point in a Leo anti-vertex. And the anti-vertex represents maybe your conscious and unconscious baseline. And this could encompass the ingrained traits, active pursuits, and maybe the literal settings you could be put in, or you could be involved with when it comes to your fated encounters in some way. And this could act as the initial domino in your fated encounters. And so, with a Leo anti-vertex, your active conscious reality could involve settings, or, maybe personality traits that involve subjectivity, expressiveness, and you could be applying your traits to radiate light or confidence or to create something. And maybe you could be the type to center yourself as a passionate gravitational pull of a situation, whether consciously or not. And your repetitive participation in this warm, expressive, or authentic area of life could set the stage. And so a catalyst event could occur within this subjective sphere. And the result of this could spark a disruption, maybe altering your trajectory by pulling you out of your personal passions, pulling you out of that place of confidence, and encouraging a more existential, objective worldview. And so, how to notice this trigger building is that you could be pouring your focus into a tight loop of creative expression. You could be working on your confidence. There could be a setting that requires validation or an audience, or there could be, a setting where you have to lead a narrative through your own light in some way. And you could be utilizing traits that keep you structurally confined to your own subjective heart. And then this trigger event could almost come up, circumstantially, exactly when this personal radiance reaches a peak, or it could just seem to come out of nowhere. And so, a few examples of how this could look in practice, just keep in mind these are more general examples. The house placement will give more specifics. An example is that maybe you consciously engage in a highly passionate, subjective endeavor, utilizing your expressive traits to seek warmth or validation or whatever it may be. And this radiance could act as the catalyst event where you cross paths with someone or something that brings an energy of cool, detached intellectualism. And the result of this shift could put you on a brand new trajectory, maybe pushing you from a passionate pursuit, or, maybe caring about what people think, into a cold, analytical, sort of outsider's perspective. And it could force you to see the world in a new way. Another example is you could focus on maintaining a dramatic or heart led narrative in some way, maybe positioning yourself as the star of a situation, or really leaning into your confidence in a situation. And this movement could set the stage for a sudden, highly disruptive structural event that kind of changes that personal narrative. And the result of navigating that disruption could permanently alter your trajectory, maybe pulling you into a vastly expanded environment characterized by unconventional, maybe a little bit more erratic, not in a bad way though, or highly logical problem solving that bypasses personal feelings. It's like maybe you're pulled into a setting where you have to focus on the system as opposed to your role within the system, if that makes sense. Another example is you could focus on operating in a space fueled by individual courage and the conscious desire to be seen. And then an event could occur that introduces a conceptual puzzle, a technological advancement, or a requirement for pure existential logic. And the result could expand your trajectory, replacing the pursuit of maybe personal validation or applause, whatever it may be, with the innovation of a collective system. Another example is you could consciously act as maybe the central point of a dynamic, or unconsciously, maybe you are in the center of something, you don't realizing it, and you surround yourself with warmth and you utilize your traits to maybe lead or to just be yourself and to bask in that. And your participation could act as the initial event, and the result could introduce a scenario that places you completely outside of that circle, and that could move your trajectory onto one that is defined by the contrarian, or the innovator or the alienated observer looking at a situation from afar. Like maybe it changes your perspective where you are less immersed in something and you have to more observe it. I don't know if that makes sense. Hopefully it does. And because this dynamic acts as a two-way loop, your Leo anti-vertex could be exactly how you process the shifts in your life of the Aquarius vertex. And so once the environment brings a macro level Aquarius destination, like navigating sudden systemic disruptions or operating as an outsider, or kind of looking at things from a new perspective, you don't have to completely lose your spark when that happens. You can use maybe your authenticity or your Leo traits in some way to ground that, and you can consciously apply your expressive warmth or your virtuous heart to humanize whatever it is that you're doing. But alternatively, you could take that objective or brilliant idea or logic or perspective that you discovered through the Aquarius vertex and bring it back to completely upgrade your Leo baseline, ensuring that your personal creations and passions are no longer, kind of like without that connected meaning, if that makes sense. It can actually push humanity or a cause or a system forward in some way. And so, when a transit or synastry person hits the anti-vertex, it illuminates kind of those subjective, creative sort of things in your life into focus, either directly or indirectly. And this expressive energy could feel highly familiar and comfortable, for better or for worse. And this could act as an affirmation of your confidence, your current path, and your ingrained sense of self. However, while this synastry connection or transit could validate the Leo side of your life, this focus on the self could create an opposition to your vertex, and over time, this comfortable familiarization could act as a domino that eventually, though not always, leads to a fated vertex trigger. But when a transit or synastry person hits the vertex directly, the fated destination could bring an unexpected reroute much more directly. It could hit you a bit harder. And this contact could illuminate your blind spots and force you to see maybe a completely new perspective. And the changes could drop into your lap, maybe bringing events or people that kind of change things for better or worse, such as maybe there is a sudden systemic disruption where you now got to make the system better. Maybe you get an innovative insight, or there could be a highly unconventional person kind of encouraging you to see things from a new perspective while you're just simply engaging in those Leo areas of life in some way. And so I hope that gives you a little bit of a hint as to how that can look. If you want to know more specifically, I do recommend going down to the timestamps and looking for your house placement. But for now, let's go on to the last sign, which is the Pisces vertex. And so now let's talk about the Pisces vertex. To understand this placement, we have to differentiate between the sign and the house of your vertex, because the house outlines the literal area that receives the change. And this could be a little bit more specific as to how this change may come. But the sign of Pisces dictates the how, the energetic flavor, the transcendent nature, and the spiritual characteristics of the fated encounters. And this can be equally as important to understanding the nature. So to understand exactly how this fluid energy could move, I would locate where Jupiter and Neptune, which are the rulers of Pisces, is in your natal chart, because this could give a more specific hint as to how this could show up in your life. And so a Pisces vertex dictates that the fated course corrections or trajectory shifts or the destined events of your life could kind of carry an energy of openness, maybe absorbing the environment through osmosis and tapping deeply into every facet of human nature. Maybe compassion, creativity, or forgiveness are also themes. And the fated encounters could introduce a scenario characterized by ambiguity, a lack of logical categorization, like maybe there's something that feels almost magical in some way, but also there could be themes of ultimate surrender or disillusioning as well. And this destination could be a literal manifestation, like being swept into a massive art project. Maybe there's a deeply spiritual environment that completely changes your life, or a situation that requires a lot of empathy, or a person that has that as well. However, this could be entirely non-literal as well, pulling you into an overarching energetic trajectory that could encourage the complete dissolution of your logical boundaries just to navigate the shift. But the vertex does require a counterbalance or a trigger. And so to find that, we locate the opposite of the vertex energy, and that will be the Virgo anti-vertex, because the anti-vertex represents your conscious and unconscious baseline, and it encompasses maybe the ingrained traits, active pursuits, or the literal settings you naturally put yourself in when it comes to those fated encounters, or maybe you're just involved with it in some way, and this could act as the initial domino. So, with a Virgo anti-vertex, your initial trigger environment could be driven by your pursuit of detail, analytical dissection, maybe practical, thoughtful application, or being of service. You could be consciously operating within environments defined by fixing what is broken or maintaining a rigid set of categories or managing microscopic details in some way. And your active presence in this realm could act as the pressure cooker. And your environment could eventually respond to this focus by introducing a catalyst event. And the result of this event could require maybe a highly fluid, boundaryless resolution that logic, organization, or service cannot touch. And so, how to notice this trigger building is you could be actively seeking environments that require mental scrutiny, or you could be maybe putting your focus, whether you want to or not, on analyzing details and categorizing information into neat, understandable boxes. And this self directed focus on maybe facts or details or data or service could eventually reach a threshold, manifesting circumstantially when a variable appears that cannot be quantified, it cannot be analyzed, it cannot be, simply fixed. And this could be maybe your environment signaling that a boundary dissolving event is imminent. And so you might want to know what this could look like in practice. I will give you a few examples. The first example, you could consciously choose a period of maybe analysis, maybe applying your traits to make sense of facts in some way, or, improving your life in some way. And this active focus on the details could set the stage for a catalyst event. And you could encounter someone or something bringing in an energy that is fluid, maybe a bit confusing, maybe deeply empathetic, or entirely unconcerned with logic and more about, merging as like one entity or merging with forgiveness in some way. And the result of this event could alter your trajectory, encouraging a shift from maybe analyzing details to simply feeling the atmosphere because that's the only way to get through it. Another example is maybe there is a period of consciously troubleshooting a problem or editing a situation or actively trying to fix a flaw. And this could reach a limit. Maybe an event occurs that renders your analysis useless. And the situation is too large or too emotional or too chaotic to fix. And the resulting trajectory could pull you out of critical thinking and place you in an environment characterized by absolute surrender and acceptance. Another example is while you could be directing your energy towards maybe judging what is practical or what is useful versus what is useless, maybe a circumstantial event could occur in some way. And the result of navigating that event or that shift could drop you into a highly nebulous or maybe saturated situation. And this shift could bring a reality characterized by empathy, where fixing the problem is not an option and you kind of just got to go with the flow in order to get by. Another example is you could actively spend years operating with mental boundaries that are kind of, stringent, or you could be treating life as a series of distinct categorical facts using your analytical traits. And then a shift or a fated encounter could act as the catalyst event, triggering maybe a sense of confusion, artistic inspiration, or collective joy or grief. You could feel at one with maybe your people or your environment or a person in some way. And the result of this timeline shift could completely dissolve the neat categories, shifting the reality entirely towards the unseen or the spiritual or the imaginative parts of life that cannot be easily explained. And because this mechanic operates as a continuous loop, your Virgo anti-vertex could become the exact toolkit you use to navigate the Pisces vertex. So when the environment maybe brings a wave of ambiguity or empathy in some way, or an overwhelming energetic absorption into your lap, you don't just have to be swept away by the current because you can consciously deploy your Virgo traits to handle it, whether it's detail, analysis, or service in some way. Or you could take the ultimate surrender or the transcendence of the Pisces vertex and take the lessons from that and bring it back to that Virgo baseline, ensuring that your service or critical thinking are fueled by compassion rather than just nervous perfection. And so when a transit or synastry person hits your anti-vertex, it will illuminate your analytical, detailed matters into focus either directly or indirectly. And this energy could feel highly familiar and comfortable for better or for worse. And it could act as an affirmation of your current path or your ingrained sense of self. However, this could also create an opposition somehow to your Pisces vertex. And over time, this comfortable familiarization could act as a domino that eventually, though not always, leads to a faded vertex trigger. But also, when a transit or synastry person hits your vertex directly, the fated destination could bring an unexpected reroute much more directly, and this contact could illuminate your blind spots and forces you to really see a completely new perspective. And this could feel like it drops into your lap, maybe bringing people or events that change things about maybe how you approach confusion or empathy or art or, the transcendent energy, or how do you merge and absorb your environment. It could completely change that and restructure your reality just while you're going about your routine analytical pursuits, because it will inevitably still affect both. And so if you want to know more specifically how this could look for you, I do recommend going down to the timestamps to look for your house placement, just to understand how this big picture may piece together. And so for now, let's go into the houses of your vertex and anti-vertex placement. With the fourth house vertex, the destined events and timeline shifts in your life could ultimately center around your home, your physical roots, your innermost self, your family dynamics, and the things that anchor you. And so this resulting destination could be highly literal, like an event directly resulting in buying real estate or buying a new home or a condo, maybe relocating your physical home, or even starting a family in some cases. But this could also be an energetic result where the shift forces you to step away from the external world in some way to completely rebuild your internal emotional baseline or to redirect it. And as I stated in the intro, triggers could be subtle or major, which is why this point could be very hard to pinpoint, but these themes will be prevalent regardless. However, to understand why a vertex event happens, we have to look directly across the chart to the 10th house anti-vertex. And so the anti-vertex represents your conscious and unconscious baseline, and it encompasses your active pursuits, your ingrained physical traits, and the literal events you naturally put yourself in. And this is kind of the first domino that falls, so to speak. And so with the 10th house anti-vertex, your baseline environment could be driven by your conscious pursuit of ambition, your unconscious drive for public validation, or the settings of leadership, visibility, responsibility, whether it involves a career or not that you naturally put yourself in. And since this is opposite of the fourth house, it's essentially where you are out of your comfort zone. And so you could actively operate in the public eye or focus heavily on achievement, maybe fulfilling external roles and managing your relationship with authority. And so your active, repetitive participation in this highly visible sphere could act as kind of the pressure cooker, and the environment will eventually respond to this heavy external focus by maybe introducing a catalyst event that disrupts your public standing or simply is a result of this pursuit. And the result of this timeline shift is potentially a fourth house outcome, resulting in a recalibration of your private internal world. And so, how you could notice the trigger building in some cases is you could notice an unconscious or a self directed focus on a career milestone, your public image, or an external pressure to succeed. Or maybe it's at a time where maybe you want to work on how you present to the world and improve your contributions and your leadership abilities. And this can be accompanied by an unconscious neglect of maybe your living situation or internal burnout, or it could come seemingly out of nowhere with no lingering fourth house struggles. It could just be a faded event anyway. And so the trigger event usually arrives circumstantially right as you hit maybe a major professional peak, when the external pressure simply becomes unsustainable, or when it feels like fate is just calling for your circumstances to change. And so some examples on what this could look like is maybe you consciously pour your energy into pursuing a career promotion or a specific industry goal, or you work on your leadership skills in some way, which is a 10th house trigger. And this active pursuit
participation could set the stage. Maybe achieving this goal or encountering a sudden shift in management will act as the catalyst. And maybe the result of this event requires a non-negotiable relocation, and this new physical environment, which is the fourth house literal destination, ends up being the exact setting where you establish your long-term roots and your permanent anchor in some way. Another example is maybe you're actively navigating a period of intense public visibility, consciously managing a leadership role, or heavy external expectations, and maybe an explosive external event acts as a catalyst, such as a public failure or a company restructure, and the resulting trajectory forces you to step away from the spotlight entirely, mandating a forced retreat that makes you reconnect with your family and rebuild your innermost emotional baseline. Another example is maybe you place yourself in a highly charged, ambitious dynamic with a boss, a mentor, an authority figure, or you seek achievement in some way, and this external interaction acts as a catalyst, maybe triggering a sudden realization about your childhood conditioning. And the result is a massive internal shift that requires that you step back and redefine what safety actually means to you away from the public eye. And then another example, maybe you consciously or unconsciously utilize your traits to successfully build a public business, putting yourself in environments that focus strictly on your reputation. And reaching this public pinnacle could act as a catalyst event, making you realize that external applause or the achievement is hollow, and the resulting trajectory pushes you to step down, shifting your energy entirely to the literal creation of a family or the building of a private homestead. And so, because this axis is a continuous feedback loop, the 10th house anti-vertex could be exactly how you manage the fourth house destination once you arrive there. And so, when the environment forces you into a heavy focus on your private life, your family, or your internal emotional security, you don't have to just drown in the domestic sphere, because you can use your 10th house traits of ambitions or leadership in some way to organize that private world. And you can apply your capacity for management to ensure that your physical home is structurally sound, and use your leadership skills to actively protect your family or your roots. Alternatively, you could use your recalibrated fourth house event to inspire your trajectory in a way that affects both, maybe bringing the deep emotional security you cultivated in the fourth house back to the 10th house, changing how you operate as a public leader in some way. And so, when a transit or synastry person hits your anti-vertex, it would illuminate your public image, your career, and ambitions into your absolute focus. And so, there could be focused themes of leadership and external achievement. And it is this illuminated focus on the public eye that inherently creates an opposition to your fourth house vertex. And that opposition is the exact mechanic that brings the fated reroute, mathematically forcing you to retreat and secure your private roots. But if a transit or synastry person hits the vertex directly, the fourth house destination simply arrives. Maybe a sudden change in your physical living situation, a massive shift in a family dynamic, or a literal person who feels like home could drop directly into your lap, instantly restructuring your private baseline while you are simply engaging in those routine 10th house career pursuits, and it will inevitably affect both in some way. And so I hope this breakdown gave you some things to think about. And so I'm curious if you've seen these points trigger in your life. And if so, I would love to hear your stories. But for now, let's move on to the next house. With the vertex in the fifth house, the resulting trajectory of your fated encounters centers on individual creative expression, romance, children, and what you create purely for the joy of it. And this resulting destination could be highly literal, like an event directly resulting in the conception of a child, or a sudden passionate romance, or launching a massive solo art project, but it could also be energetic, pushing you onto a trajectory that forces you to prioritize your own subjective pleasure and self-expression, maybe over the group consensus, and to get in touch with your inner child. And as I stated in the intro, triggers could be subtle or they could be major, which is why this point could be very hard to pinpoint, but these themes will be prevalent regardless. But to trigger a vertex event, we must look at the 11th house anti-vertex, which is the opposite point of your vertex. So the anti-vertex represents your conscious and unconscious baseline. It encompasses your active pursuits, your your ingrained traits or the literal environments you may naturally put yourself in. And this will be the initial domino that kind of triggers maybe a vertex event in your life. And so with an 11th house anti-vertex, your baseline environment could be driven by your conscious focus on community, your unconscious drive to find your place in society. Maybe it involves the higher dreams and aspirations you have, and the settings maybe of the networks or the social media sort of interactions that you naturally gravitate towards. And you may actively operate maybe within the crowd, maybe you focus on collective goals, you manage audience expectations, or you may simply have a large aspiration to make a difference in the world, or you could just be in settings where you are navigating the larger web. Hint, hint, if you are on YouTube or on social media, that kind of counts as well. And so your participation in this collective sphere could act as the mechanism or the trigger for the vertex event, although this can't be forced, it'll just happen, you know. And so the environment may eventually respond to this collective or existential focus by introducing an event that isolates or separates you from the crowd or brings you back to your creative sphere in some way. And the result of this timeline shift is a highly individualized fifth house outcome, whether it is minor or major. And so, how to notice the trigger is building is maybe you notice a focus on maintaining a network. Maybe you are participating in an online community, or maybe there's a sort of pull to branch out and find your role in society in some way, or you're just involved with the 11th house community themes in some way, or in networks or in causes. And this can kind of be accompanied by maybe an unconscious growing sense of dissatisfaction or feeling unseen as a unique individual, but not always. This isn't always the case. It could just be a neutral participation in these spaces, and then maybe the trigger happens. And so the trigger event often strikes very circumstantially when you are sort of focused on that 11th house bubble, or it's through that 11th house bubble, kind of introducing a variable that could ask you to stand alone or to find your own personal spark within that noise in some way, or maybe to connect with that joy again. And so just for some examples, just so you can see what this could look like, is maybe, for example, you consciously participate in a standardized, learning cohort, or you actively put yourself in the broad structure of a community organization. And maybe during a collective experience you're having, a catalyst event occurs, maybe an encounter with a specific mentor, or a sudden conflict with the group's rules acts as kind of the catalyst, and maybe the result of navigating this shift forces you out of the collective structure and maybe unlocks a pure individualized passion or a hobby. Maybe you learn about what you like, and this changes your trajectory entirely towards something that brings you personal joy. Another example is maybe you actively branch out to network with a new group of associates or friends, and you consciously utilize your traits to spend time with a wider platonic friend group. And maybe this act of community is kind of what sets the stage. And then maybe a catalyst occurs within your network. Maybe you are introduced to somebody who disrupts the platonic dynamic, if you know what I'm saying, hint, hint, and the resulting trajectory shifts the energy from collective networking into a singular, highly passionate romantic relationship. Another example is maybe you consciously spend time building an audience or participating heavily in social media, even if you're not necessarily an influencer, or focusing on what the collective wants. And a routine interaction or a piece of extreme feedback from this network will act as the catalyst. Maybe it sparks a life-altering shift that pulls you out of the community management and pulls you directly into the solo spotlight, kind of forcing you to launch a personal, subjective, creative venture that you otherwise wouldn't have done. Another example is maybe you are actively invested in a vision for a community project or societal cause, could be political, could be anything, and you place yourself in environments that prioritize the group or the cause over the individual, and maybe an event or a conflict within that group forces a necessary separation, and the resulting trajectory pushes you to abandon the collective vision and pursue a path that brings you absolute individual fulfillment, such as focusing on your own self-expression, deciding to have children, or just, really inspires you to get in touch with your inner child again. And because this axis, it kind of acts as a continuous feedback loop, the 11th house anti-vertex may be exactly how you manage the 5th house destination once you arrive there. So when the environment forces you into the center of the spotlight, or it forces you to evaluate your joy, or it brings you a dramatic creative endeavor, or it gives you a new focus on raising a child, whatever it may be, maybe you could actively use your 11th house traits of community awareness or dreams or visions or causes to ground that. Maybe you can apply your networking skills to ensure your subjective joy actually connects to society, preventing your personal creations from existing in a vacuum. But conversely, you could use your newly found 5th house individual joy to fundamentally upgrade your 11th house baseline. Hint, hint. This is what I did making this YouTube channel. And maybe this will take your subjective, heartfelt creations and eventually you can share them to inspire the larger collective in your own way, of course. And so when a transit or when a synastry person hits your anti-vertex, it could illuminate your friendships, your community ties, and collective goals into your focus. You could become consciously focused on your place in society or just simply involved within it. And it is this illuminated 11th house focus that could create an opposition to your 5th house vertex. And that opposition may act as the exact mechanic that brings the fated reroute, mathematically kind of forcing you to separate from the group and find your own individual joy in some way. But conversely, when a transit or synastry person hits your vertex directly, the 5th house destination arrives unannounced, maybe a sudden surge of creative inspiration, the unexpected conception of a child, or a literal romantic partner kind of drops directly into your lap, instantly restructuring your reality while you are simply engaging maybe with your routine 11th house ambitions or networks, and it changes the landscape of both somehow. And so I do hope that this breakdown gave you some things to think about, and I'm curious if you've seen these points trigger in your life, and if so, I would love to hear your stories. But for now, let's move on to the next house. A 6th house vertex dictates that the fated course corrections in your life could ultimately manifest tangibly through your physical health, your day-to-day routine, the nature of your work itself, and the way you manage the mundane. And this resulting destination can be highly literal, like an event encouraging you to adopt a strict medical regimen, maybe change your daily work environment, or to take on a highly structured job. But this shift could be energetic as well, maybe pulling you onto a trajectory that asks you to step out of your head and to focus on the practical, grounded service to manage your reality. And as I stated in the intro, triggers can be minor or major, which is why this point can be so hard to pinpoint, but these themes will be prevalent regardless. But the vertex does require a trigger, and so to find it, we will look to the opposite side of your chart, which is the 12th house anti-vertex. And the anti-vertex represents your conscious and unconscious baseline. It encompasses your active pursuits, your ingrained traits, and the literal environments you naturally put yourself in, and this will act as the first domino that falls over that could trigger your vertex in some way. And so with a 12th house anti-vertex, your baseline environment could be driven by your conscious pursuit of spirituality, your unconscious gravitation towards isolation, and the unseen things like retreats, hospitals, behind the scene roles that you naturally put yourself in or are unconsciously involved in. And you may actively operate in the subconscious realm. You could deal with the parts of life that transcend the earthly plane, and your repetitive participation in this highly isolated or fluid sphere could act as a pressure cooker in some way, and the environment could eventually respond to this unseen internal reality by introducing a catalyst event that disrupts the isolation. And the result of this shift could require a highly physical, structured resolution in your daily 6th house life. And so how to notice the trigger building is you could notice maybe a self-directed focus or an unconscious involvement, maybe with a spiritual pursuit. Maybe there's a growing unconscious desire to withdraw from society or a heavy immersion in environments that lack physical structure. And this could be accompanied by a feeling of detachment from mundane responsibilities. But this could also just come out of seemingly nowhere. Maybe you're just doing what you normally do. And the trigger event may arrive circumstantially when this internal isolation reaches a peak, maybe potentially manifesting as a calling that asks you to return to tangible reality in some way, or it redirects what your tangible reality looks like. And so, just to understand what this could look like in practice, I'll give a few examples. The first example, maybe you consciously choose a period of isolation or actively focus your traits on navigating your mental health, spirituality, and the unseen realms. And this internal withdrawal sets the stage. Maybe a catalyst event occurs. You could cross paths with maybe a destined health practitioner or encounter a physical limit. And the result of this shift could introduce a highly specific diet or physical protocol or a strict daily routine that encourages you to physically ground and manage your body a little bit better. Another example is maybe you unconsciously navigate an environment of hidden workplace politics, unresolved grief, or active escapism behind closed doors. And this invisible pressure builds until it reaches a tipping point, acting as a catalyst event. And the resulting trajectory could bring a sudden circumstantial change to your tangible employment, prompting you to take on a completely different type of daily work to restore order to your physical life. Another example is you could actively put yourself in hidden environments, such as volunteering in an isolated institution like an animal shelter, or maybe you're simply existing in a prolonged phase of solitude. And then a catalyst event occurs where you are drawn to maybe an act of practical rescue, such as adopting a pet, just for example, because the sixth house does deal with pets. And the result of this event could act as a mandatory kind of shift in how you manage your everyday routine, really pulling you into the physical world to provide day-to-day service in a new and different way. And then another example is you could consciously spend years in isolation, actively utilizing your traits to privately study esoteric subjects like astrology or the subconscious mind in secret in some way. And then maybe a circumstantial shift or fated encounter could force a disruption of this privacy, and maybe the resulting trajectory could turn your hidden transcendent knowledge into a structured, mundane job where you provide practical service to others on a regular daily schedule. And so, because this access acts as a continuous feedback loop, the 12th house anti-vertex could be exactly how you manage the 6th house destination once you arrive there. And so when the environment brings a heavy period of mundane work or intense physical health regimens or strict daily routines, you don't have to just become a mechanical robot. You could actively use your 12th house traits of spiritual understanding, deep empathy, and connections to the unseen to inform your daily habits, turning a basic routine into a spiritual practice. But conversely, you could take the grounded, practical skills you learned in the 6th house and use them to bring structure, organization, and tangible healing to the 12th house subconscious or spiritual communities or, isolated sort of institutions that you're a part of. And so when a transit or synastry person hits the anti-vertex, this could illuminate your subconscious, maybe how you isolate and your spiritual matters and put it into focus. You could become consciously kind of focused on what is unseen, and you could retreat from the world. And it is this illuminated focus on the transcendent that inherently creates an opposition to the 6th house vertex, and that opposition could act as a mechanic that brings the fated reroute, potentially prompting you to restructure your physical body and manage your reality. But conversely, when a transit or a synastry person hits the vertex directly, the 6th house destination may arrive more unannounced. Maybe a sudden change in your physical employment, maybe a shift in your health routine, for example, or a literal person entering your immediate work environment. It just drops into your lap in some way, potentially grounding your reality while you're just simply engaging in your conscious 12th house internal retreats. And so it does inevitably affect both, but this is a more kind of punchy manifestation of the vertex. And so I hope this breakdown gave you a few things to think about. I am curious if you've ever seen these points trigger in your life, and if so, I would love to hear your stories. But for now, let's move on to the next house. When the vertex is in the 7th house, the resulting trajectory of your fated encounters could center entirely on partnerships, the mirror of another person, and the exchange of you versus other individuals. And this resulting destination could be highly literal, like an event directly resulting in a marriage, signing a business contract, or encountering a significant open adversary, or just connecting with a significant person on a one on one level. But it can also be an energetic result where the shift pushes you onto a trajectory that asks for compromise and the softening of unilateral decision making in some way. And as I stated in the intro, triggers can be minor or subtle, or they could be very major and big, which is why this point can be hard to pinpoint because sometimes these themes don't even stand out in your conscious mind, but these themes will be prevalent regardless. However, a vertex event is a reaction to the trigger, and the trigger is found directly across the chart, which is your first house anti-vertex. And the anti-vertex represents your conscious and unconscious baseline. It encompasses your active pursuits, your ingrained traits, and the literal environments you may naturally put yourself in. And this will kind of act as the initial domino that could kind of result in that fated vertex event. And so, with a first house anti-vertex, your baseline environment might be driven by your conscious pursuit of autonomy, your unconscious gravitation towards self-reliance, and the settings where you actively assert your own solo identity. And you could operate heavily through the window of I or me, actively focusing on your appearance or your physical body. Maybe you adopt a focus on building confidence at this time, and your self directed path and your repetitive participation in this independent sphere could act as the mechanism, and the environment could eventually respond to this focus on the self by introducing a catalyst event that disrupts your autonomy and connects you to other people. And the result of this timeline shift could drop the exact partnership or confrontation you need into your lap to teach you the mechanics of the other in some way. And so, how to notice this trigger building is maybe you notice a self directed or unconscious focus on your own physical identity. Maybe you're actively rebranding yourself or consciously aiming to rely solely on yourself and building your own confidence. And this could be accompanied by an unconscious lack of awareness regarding how your independence impacts the space around you, but not necessarily in a negative way, just in a way that aligns with learning how to navigate the world. We've all been there, we've all done that. And the trigger event could arrive circumstantially right at the peak of your self-sufficiency, or maybe when you are trying to find it, introducing a variable you simply cannot handle entirely alone, or that just pulls you towards a bubble of connection. And this just seems like it's out of nowhere almost. And so I'll give a few examples on what this could look like in practice, just so you can visualize it. Example number one is maybe you consciously pour your energy into personal development. You actively utilize your traits to carve out maybe a business path or an independent life in some way. And this active alignment of self-sufficiency makes you highly visible, acting as the catalyst event that attracts maybe a fated business partner, a manager, or even a spouse. And the result of this timeline shift could push you out of your solo lane, asking you to share the reins in a formal, binding seventh house partnership. Another example is maybe you could actively put yourself in an environment that does focus strictly on the self, consciously making a change to your appearance, your body, or the way you project your identity into the world. And then maybe this physical change acts as the direct catalyst event for crossing paths with somebody. A good example, you go to the hair salon, you change your hair, and then on the way home, maybe you run into somebody, and the resulting trajectory could alter your life from focusing on maybe yourself to navigating the mirror of a long-term fated romantic relationship. And you wouldn't have run into that person if you didn't go get your hair cut. That's just an example. Another one is maybe your conscious assertion of self-reliance and an intense focus on your solo goals could create an environmental blind spot. And then maybe the heavy focus on yourself could act as a catalyst that pulls in a karmic relationship or a sudden open enemy. And then the resulting energy of this clash could demand a trajectory shift, encouraging you to learn the mechanics of negotiation, fairness, and how to deal with other people. Like maybe through that tough connection, you learned more about personal strength or how to negotiate or how to deal with people who you don't agree with. And then that kind of changes your trajectory for the better if you can adopt that lesson. And then another example is maybe you actively pursue your own individual goals and you utilize your traits to move forward without consulting anybody else. And then this momentum could lead to a catalyst event where you must secure your goal by signing a contract, a lease, or entering a binding agreement. And the result is that the stipulations of this specific seventh house partnership or contract could become the defining trajectory of your life, altering how you kind of relate to the self, but also how you relate to others and those like contracts that you sign. And because this acts as a continuous feedback loop, the first house anti-vertex could be exactly how you manage the seventh house destination once you arrive there. And so when the environment brings a heavy partnership or a contract or an intense one-on-one mirror, you don't have to lose yourself completely. You can actively use your first house traits of self-assertion or identity and who you are, your confidence, to navigate it, ensuring that the exchange remains a meeting of two whole individuals rather than total codependency or, feeling like you're caged. Alternatively, though, you could take the deep lessons of compromising and mirroring learned from that seventh house fated, event and use them to permanently upgrade your first house sense of self and personal identity, returning to your solo path as a more balanced and wise individual. And so when a transit or synastry person hits the anti-vertex, this could be a time where your self-identity, your physical body, and your independence is put into focus, and you could become consciously kind of fixated on your own path or your appearance. And it is this illuminated focus on the me that inherently creates an opposition to your seventh house vertex, and that opposition could act as the mechanic that brings the fated reroute, potentially prompting you to experience a partnership or an adversary that asks for compromise. But conversely, when a transit or synastry person hits the vertex directly, that seventh house destination, that person, that connection, that mirror of another person could arrive completely out of nowhere or announced. Like a sudden marriage or an abrupt legal contract or a literal partner could kind of drop directly into your lap, potentially restructuring your reality while you're simply engaging with your conscious first house solo pursuits. And so it will kind of affect both in some way. And so I do hope that this breakdown gives you a little bit to think about. And I'm curious, have you seen these points trigger in your life? And if so, I would love to hear your stories. But for now, let's move on to the next house. With an eighth house vertex, the resulting trajectory of the destined events in your life could revolve around the deep parts of life, shared resources, intimacy, and the parts of reality you simply cannot easily control. And the resulting destination could be highly literal, like an event directly resulting in managing an inheritance, taking on a shared debt, or dealing with the reality of life and death, or, gaining an intimate connection. But it can also be a purely energetic result. Maybe it places you onto a trajectory that asks for psychological transformation and the merging of your life with another entity in some way. And as I stated in the intro, the triggers could be very subtle, but they could be major, which is why this point could be hard to pinpoint. It's why a lot of people are like, I don't really know if this point is valid, but these themes will be prevalent regardless. But these fated events do require a trigger, and that trigger is located opposite of the vertex in your second house anti-vertex. And the anti-vertex represents your conscious and unconscious baseline. It encompasses your active pursuits, your ingrained traits, or the literal environments you naturally put yourself in, and this will act as the first domino in this vertex event or events that you deal with throughout your life. And so, with a second house anti vertex, your baseline environment could be driven by your conscious pursuit of personal possessions, maybe your unconscious focus on self esteem, and the settings of resource building you naturally put yourself in. You could actively operate in a sphere focused on what you individually own, carefully managing your tangible values and securing your solo comfort zone. And your repetitive participation in this highly personal material realm could act as a pressure cooker, and the environment could eventually respond to this focus on what is yours by introducing a catalyst that disrupts or at least puts into focus your personal security and the lack thereof. And the result of this timeline shift could push an eighth house outcome, asking you to merge, transform, or surrender control to the unknown in some way. And how to notice this trigger building is maybe you could notice a self directed or unconscious focus on accumulation. Maybe you're actively saving money, you're buying things, you're learning to manage your time and skills because, yes, those are the second house themes, in my opinion. Or maybe you're building a fortress of personal security and self worth. And this could be accompanied by an unconscious reluctance to rely on anybody else financially or emotionally. Or maybe you just find that what you are dealing with kind of pulls you initially to do it on your own terms. And the trigger event could arrive circumstantially when your personal resources reach a threshold, or it could come when you least expect it, kind of introducing a variable that pulls the control a little bit away from you and into an outside force, whether it's energetic or literal. And so, just a few examples on what this could look like, just so you can understand the dynamic is maybe you consciously pour your energy into building your personal financial stability. You actively utilize your traits to secure your private resources and your values. And this act of accumulation could set the stage. Maybe hitting a specific financial goal could act as the catalyst event, qualifying you for an investment opportunity, a business merger, or even a marriage. And the resulting trajectory could require completely merging your assets and altering your financial reality by intertwining it with another entity. Another example is you could actively entrench yourself in your material possessions and consciously maintain a firm grip on your personal comfort zone to maybe protect your self esteem. And then this focus could set the stage for a circumstantial crisis, not in a way that you should be scared of because you're strong, you know? It could be like an unexpected debt or an economic shift. And the result of this event could disrupt your solo security, but it could prompt a period of vulnerability where you may need to ask for financial help or undergo a psychological restructuring regarding money and control. And this could be something fated that helps you to embrace, the unseen or the parts of life that you can't control a little bit better and build your resilience. Another example is you could actively put yourself in environments focused on entirely on doing the quiet internal work of building your own self-worth and feeling secure in your own skin. And achieving this solid baseline could act as the catalyst event, opening a door you previously kept locked, and the resulting trajectory could introduce an intimate relationship, encouraging you to merge your life or your body or your psychological depth with somebody else, all because you worked on yourself and your self-esteem. Another example is maybe you consciously focus your actions on the mundane and you actively center your life on earning your own living, managing your bank account, or defining your own values. Just, living life, doing your thing. And then maybe an uncontrollable event could occur, like the passing of somebody in your periphery or a legal settlement in some way. And the result could be an unexpected inheritance or a transfer of shared wealth that pushes you out of your safe zone, placing you on a trajectory where you could manage complex eighth house resources, and you kind of have to use that second house, ability that you have to do so. And because this acts as a continuous feedback loop, the second house anti-vertex could be exactly how you manage the eighth house destination once you arrive there, kind of like I talked about in the last example. So maybe when the environment brings a period of psychological transformation, intimacy, or the intense management of shared resources, you don't have to lose your footing completely. Maybe you could actively use your second house traits of self-worth or tangible grounding or your resources to navigate it. And you could use your second house self-esteem as a life raft to maintain your core identity while merging with the unknown and keeping resilient. But on the flip side, you could take the deep psychological transformations of the eighth house and use that newfound depth to completely redefine your second house personal values and how you earn for a living. Like, for example, it's like, you learn to invest. That's kind of eighth house related, but then you use it to make more money. That's second house related. That's just one example. And so, when a transit or a synastry person hits your anti-vertex, it could illuminate your personal finances, your possessions, and your self-esteem into focus in some way, and you could become consciously hyperfixated or just focus in general on your values and what you own at this time. And it is this illuminated focus on your security that inherently creates an opposition to the eighth house vertex, and that opposition could in some ways act as the mechanic that brings a fated reroute, maybe encouraging you to experience a crisis or a merger or just an opening of the parts of life that you fear that demands a deep transformation. Or conversely, when a transit or a synastry person hits that vertex directly, the eighth house destination could arrive completely unannounced. Maybe a sudden tax issue, an inheritance, or a literal person encouraging psychological intimacy just drops directly into your life out of nowhere, maybe potentially restructuring your reality. And while you're just simply engaging in your conscious second house routine of building your own security, and it kind of affects both in some ways. And so I do hope that this breakdown gave you some things to think about. And I'm curious if you've seen these points trigger in your life. And if so, I would love to hear your stories. But for now, let's move on to the next house. A ninth house vertex dictates that the resulting trajectory of your fated course corrections or encounters or, fated events could inherently involve expansion, exploring beyond yourself, higher learning your beliefs. And the resulting destination can manifest in highly literal ways, such as events resulting in global travel, maybe entering university, dealing with international relations, publishing a book, but it can just as easily be non literal. It could be an energetic outcome where the event encourages you to adopt a completely new overarching belief system and fundamentally shifting your macro level worldview. And as I stated in the intro, triggers can be minor or they could be major, which is why this point can be so hard to pinpoint. It's why a lot of people are like, I don't know if my vertex is valid, but these themes will be prevalent regardless. However, to kind of activate this energy, we have to look at the trigger, and the trigger is found at the exact opposite point, which for you is in the third house anti-vertex. And the anti-vertex represents your conscious and unconscious baseline. It encompasses your active pursuits, your ingrained traits, and the literal environments you naturally put yourself in. And this is the initial domino that falls, although this isn't something that you can consciously trigger, although maybe sometimes it just kind of happens. That's what the vertex is. It's all about fate. And with a third house anti-vertex, your baseline environment could be driven by your conscious pursuit of immediate information, your unconscious reliance on your local environment, and the settings of routine communication you naturally gravitate towards, maybe. And you could actively operate on a micro level, focusing on the mindset of your neighborhood, your daily commute, and the gathering of localized puzzle pieces, and your repetitive participation in this highly familiar, fast paced sphere could act as the mechanism. And the environment could eventually respond to this focus on immediate details by introducing a catalyst event that kind of disrupts your local reality. And the result of this timeline shift could pull you onto a trajectory that encourages a massive ninth house macro level expansion. And so, how to notice the trigger building is that you could notice a self directed or unconscious focus on maybe maintaining a local routine, mastering a basic skill, or engaging in repetitive mundane conversations, or maybe just your mindset in some way is at the forefront. And this could be accompanied by an unconscious growing sense of restlessness or boredom, or maybe there's nothing extraordinary happening and it comes when you least expect it. And the trigger event could occur circumstantially during a completely routine errand or a short trip, or it could just come at a time where your thoughts and ideas are kind of busy, introducing a variable in some way that your localized mindset simply cannot easily process. And if you want to know what this could look like, I will outline a few examples. The first example is you could consciously pour your energy into your daily environment, actively utilizing your communication traits to engage in routine conversations. Maybe you're conversating with anybody, but it could be like neighbors or siblings, local peers, because that's third house related as well. And this localized focus kind of sets the stage, maybe a casual chat at a local place or just a chat in general. Anything where you're talking, because that's the third house, could act as the catalyst event, introducing a massive concept or a piece of shocking information. And the result of this timeline shift could serve as the exact push that leads you to adopt a completely new philosophical belief system or enroll in a new university program. Another example is you could actively navigate your standard local commute, consciously moving through maybe familiar structures and like the things that you usually encounter in your day to day life. And then maybe a mundane detour on your way to the grocery store could act as a catalyst event, maybe resulting in an encounter with a foreigner or an academic or somebody from a completely different cultural background or just somebody who has a different set of beliefs than you. And the resulting trajectory could alter your life, maybe pulling you out of your zip code and into global travel or even international relocation in some ways. Another example is you could consciously focus your actions heavily on maintaining a local community blog or writing a personal journal or actively mastering a basic communication skill like coding. And this repetitive work could act as a catalyst when it unexpectedly catches the attention of a publisher or it goes viral online. And the resulting trajectory could encourage a massive expansion of your reach, shifting your reality from speaking to, a very small localized area to broadcasting whatever it is that you have to a broad global audience. Another example is maybe you actively put yourself in environments that revolve around managing a dispute, a shared project, or daily interactions involving a sibling, a close relative, and this localized family matter could act as the initial event. Maybe resolving or expanding upon this issue could act as the catalyst that kind of prompts you onto a trajectory where you must engage with a higher court system or could require you to relocate to a different country entirely. And this completely changes your worldview. This is a very broad example. Just take it with, the dynamics of the third house and the ninth house. Like something starts small and it gets bigger. And because this dynamic does function as a two-way loop, the third house anti-vertex could be exactly how you process the massive shifts of the ninth house vertex. So once the environment brings a macro level ninth house destination, you could consciously apply your skills in immediate communication, data processing, or localized mindset to break down this massive ninth house concept, whether it's navigating a foreign country or wrestling with a new belief or entering higher academia. And you want to break it down kind of into digestible information that you can actually use in your daily life. Conversely, you could take the overarching macro level wisdom you did gain from that ninth house event and bring it back to elevate your third house local community, changing the way your immediate environment operates or changing the way you think or you write or you communicate, you name it. And so when a transit or synastry person does hit your anti-vertex, it could illuminate your local environment, your daily commute, and your immediate communications and put all of these things into focus. You could become consciously fixated on gathering facts. Maybe there's something about your neighborhood that's relevant, and it is this illuminated focus on the micro level that inherently creates an opposition to your ninth house vertex. And that opposition could act as the mechanic that brings the fated reroute, potentially encouraging you to look up from your immediate surroundings and explore the broader world. But conversely, if a transit or a synastry person hits the vertex directly, the ninth house expansion could arrive directly at your doorstep. It could be more punchy, maybe a sudden opportunity for travel, a shift in your religious beliefs, or a literal teacher or a foreigner drops directly into your lap, encouraging an immediate trajectory shift, while you're just simply engaging with your conscious routine third house happenings, but the event could affect both in some way. And so I hope this breakdown gave you some things to think about. I'm curious if you've seen these points trigger in your life, and if so, I would love to hear your stories. But for now, let's wrap up the video.